Section 1. The World Before the Bombs. A Paradise Built on Lies. There is a version of the 1950s that never ended. Picture it slowly. Wide roads with chrome-bumpered cars humming along on nuclear fusion. Drive-in theaters lit up against a perfect American sunset. Cheerful advertisements for Nuka-Cola and sugar bombs plastered across every surface. Families gathered around their television sets watching wholesome programming. The women in their pressed dresses, the men in their ties, and above all of it, this sense, this warm, slightly hollow sense that everything is fine, that everything will always be fine, that the future is a place with smooth edges and a friendly face. That is the world of Fallout before the bombs fell. The Fallout universe diverged from our own timeline somewhere around the end of the Second World War. While our world moved into the transistor era, computing, miniaturization, and eventually the digital age, Fallout's world took a different road. Technology advanced rapidly, but the culture never did. They got nuclear fusion for their cars, they got robots in their homes, they got personal computers the size of a refrigerator, but the social attitudes, the fashion, the music, the politics, all of it stayed locked in that shiny post-war optimism, pleasantly, terrifyingly, permanently frozen. And underneath all that cheerfulness, beneath every smiling billboard and every catchy jingle, the world was quietly running out of the one thing it needed to keep the machine going: oil, clean water, arable land. The basic materials of civilization. By the 2050s, the situation was reaching a point that diplomats described in careful, measured language, and that everyone else could feel in their bones. The resource wars had begun. Those wars didn't have a single starting gun. They crept forward over years, a slow escalation across continents. The European Commonwealth, already struggling under its own weight, sent forces into the Middle East to secure the last reliable petroleum fields, and what started as a military action turned into the kind of grinding conflict that swallows generations. The United Nations, an organization that had been losing its grip on relevance for decades, dissolved entirely in July of 2052, unable to mediate a world that no longer wanted mediation. It simply stopped existing one day, its member states walking away from the conference tables and back to their war rooms. Meanwhile, in America, things had taken on a particular flavor of anxious denial. The government kept the music playing, kept the advertisements running, kept the Nuka-Cola fountains bubbling, but behind the scenes something much darker was taking shape. A corporation called Vault Tech had been given an enormous government contract to build a series of underground shelters. Publicly, these were sold as the crowning achievement of American ingenuity, a way to preserve civilization if the unthinkable happened. The advertisements showed smiling families stepping into clean, well-lit bunkers, their futures bright and secure. What the advertisements did not show was the truth. Vault-Tec had no real intention of saving the American public. Or rather, saving people was almost incidental to their actual purpose. The vaults were designed from the beginning as sealed laboratories. Each one would house a different experiment, testing different variables on human psychology, biology, sociology, and behavior. The residents would have no idea. They would think they were survivors. They would think they had been chosen. And in a sense, they had been chosen as subjects, chosen as data points, chosen as raw material for a corporate project that treated human lives as variables in an equation. All of this, the resource wars, the dissolving international order, the secret architecture of the Vault program, was happening against a backdrop of escalating tension between the United States and the People's Republic of China. The two superpowers had been circling each other for decades, but in 2066, the circle finally closed. China, desperate for the oil that Alaska's reserves represented, sent its military across the Bering Strait. The invasion of Alaska had begun. What followed was a decade of brutal, grinding war. General Constantine Chase led American forces through conditions that would later be memorialized and sanitized into a training simulation, Operation Anchorage, recreated as a clean, heroic adventure in a virtual reality program, stripped of its actual horror. In reality, men died in frozen mud, power armor or not. Resources hemorrhaged, diplomatic options narrowed to nothing. By early 2077, American power armor units had managed to reclaim Anchorage and push the Chinese military back, but the victory felt hollow. The war wasn't over. It had simply moved to a different kind of stalemate, and stalemates, in a world running out of everything, have a particular kind of gravity. They pull toward collapse with slow, inevitable patience. And so the great machine of civilization ground on, playing its cheerful music, right up until the morning of the 23rd of October, 2077. What happened on that morning? Who fired first? Why the talks failed? Who made the decision that ended the world is a mystery that the Fallout series has never fully resolved. And we will spend a long, careful time with that question later in this journey. But for now, just hold the image of it. A world that looked like the future but felt like the past. A world that had all the technology of tomorrow and none of the wisdom to use it. A world where corporations ran experiments on their own customers and governments managed their citizens like livestock, and everyone smiled and waved and said everything was fine. The bombs fell on a Saturday morning. They fell fast. Nuclear exchanges tend to operate in compressed, terrible time. Within 2 hours, the great cities of the world were ash. The cheerful billboards kept standing for a while, their smiling cartoon mascots grinning over fields of rubble. Nuka-Cola bottles rolled through the ruins. And deep underground, in their sealed concrete bunkers, the people of Vault-Tech's experiment program woke up to the sound of recirculated air and the realization that the world above had become something no advertisement could have prepared them for. This is where the games begin. In the ruins, in the aftermath, in the questions that have no clean answers. And we are going to walk through those questions slowly, together, for as long as you need. Because the wasteland has more secrets than any one survivor could find in a lifetime, and some of them are genuinely beautiful in the way that strange, old, complicated things can be beautiful. Settle in. Get comfortable. The Geiger counter clicks softly in the background, like a strange clock measuring out the hours of the new world. Before we go further, if you are watching this somewhere quiet, or have been listening for a while already, drop a comment with where you are and what time it is where you live. There is something comforting about knowing this is reaching people all over the place. Different time zones, different skies, all of us in the same wasteland together. And if you have not yet, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. And more of these are coming. Section 2. Who actually started the Great War? The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077, and the world ended in 2 hours. That much is agreed upon. Everything else, who pulled the trigger, why diplomacy failed at the last moment, whose hand reached for the button first, has been left deliberately, fascinatingly ambiguous across every Fallout game ever made. It is one of the series' most carefully maintained mysteries, and the answer, or rather the many possible answers, paint a picture of a world so thoroughly sick with its own contradictions that even the apocalypse had multiple plausible architects. The official version, at least the version that most of the games present as the baseline assumption, is that China fired first. The Sino-American War had been grinding on since 2066. China had lost Alaska, had been pushed back on multiple fronts, and was facing the kind of desperate resource scarcity that historically tends to produce desperate decisions. The logic of a preemptive nuclear strike from a cornered power has a horrible kind of coherence to it. Strike first. Strike everything. Deny your enemy the resources they would use to destroy you. It is the terminal logic of mutually assured destruction. The conclusion that the entire theory of nuclear deterrence was always quietly hoping no one would actually reach. And yet, the moment you spend any time in the Fallout games reading terminals, picking up holotapes, and listening carefully to the people who were there, the survivors, the ghouls who actually lived through October 23rd, the old recordings from the days just before the war, the China fired first narrative starts to develop cracks. Start with Vault-Tech. The Fallout TV series, released in 2024 and considered canon, includes a scene that the games had been dancing around for years. A meeting of the most powerful corporations in the world, Vault-Tech, Robco, Big MT, West-Tech, and others sitting around a table discussing what comes after the war. Not if the war comes, after. The implication is clear. At some level, the people running these corporations knew the bombs were coming, and not merely in the sense that the whole world could feel the escalation. They knew specifically. They had planned for it. And there is a further implication, left hanging in the air like smoke, that Vault-Tech may have had a hand in ensuring the war happened because a war was good for business. The vaults were already built. The experiments were already designed. All they needed was for someone to start the end of the world. Whether Vault-Tec actually launched the first missiles is never confirmed outright. The game files from Fallout 76 include a note, a small, hidden detail in the White Springs congressional bunker that references Barb Howard, a Vault-Tec executive, suggesting the company could drop the first nukes. It reads less like a plan and more like someone considering the option, testing the idea in private correspondence. But in a corporation that had already decided to run experiments on its own customers, the step from "we will profit from the apocalypse" to "we will initiate the apocalypse" is smaller than it might otherwise seem. Then there is the Enclave. The Enclave in Fallout is the remnant of the American government, not the government that ordinary citizens knew, with its public buildings and elected representatives, but the shadow government, the bunker government, the men in expensive suits who had decided decades earlier that some Americans were more American than others. By early 2077, the president and the Enclave's leadership had already retreated to secure locations, an oil rig off the California coast, the White Spring Resort in what would become Appalachia. They were already in position, already prepared, already waiting. You do not simply happen to be in a nuclear bunker when the bombs fall. You go there because you know. There is a DEFCON status terminal in the switchboard, the old CIA facility in Fallout 4, that records the events of the morning of October 23rd in painstaking detail. Unknown submersible objects were sighted off the California coast at 12:03 a.m. High-altitude bombers were detected over the Bering Strait at 3:37 a.m. A Chinese stealth submarine, the Yangtze, fired its warheads from the east coast. At 9:13 a.m., the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System detected the first missile launches, and the United States went to DEFCON 2. At 9:26 a.m., the president ordered a retaliatory strike, 4 minutes. That was the window between detecting the launches and ordering retaliation, 4 minutes to confirm the end of civilization. And here is where it gets strange. The detection system that triggered the DEFCON change, was it accurate? Mothership Zeta, the Alien DLC for Fallout 3, introduces evidence, fragmentary and unsettling, that the Zetan aliens who had been observing Earth for centuries may have had more than a passive interest in the war. The DLC's terminals and holotapes suggest the aliens had been collecting intelligence, studying humanity, perhaps even running interference. One log hints that soldiers may have been launching missiles while under alien influence, and that the Zetans had somehow come into possession of nuclear launch codes. It is speculative, deliberately left vague, but the Zetans, as a third party with their own agenda, sits quietly in the lore, an uncomfortable possibility. What makes the "who started it" question so interesting from a narrative standpoint is that the games seem to have been designed with the ambiguity intentional. Tim Kaine, one of Fallout's original creators, has stated in interviews that China was meant to have fired first, in keeping with the Cold War logic of the setting. But Bethesda, when they took over the series with Fallout 3, began layering in enough contradictions and alternative possibilities to muddy those waters significantly. It is possible that Bethesda's version of the lore genuinely does not have a definitive answer, that the people who made the games themselves are comfortable with the question remaining open. There is something deeply appropriate about that. Because the whole premise of the Fallout series, its philosophical spine, the thing it keeps returning to across every game, is that the causes of the apocalypse are diffuse. The war was not started by one bad actor. It was built, incrementally, over decades, by a civilization that kept choosing short-term profit over long-term survival, that dressed its most predatory impulses in patriotic language, that gave its corporations the power of nations, and then acted surprised when those corporations behaved accordingly. The Great War was not an accident. It was a destination that the whole world was driving toward, whether or not anyone admitted it. The specific hand that pushed the button first matters less than the system that built the button in the first place. Fallout knows this. That is why the answer is kept just out of reach. Because if you could point at one specific villain, one government, one executive, one moment of human failure, then you could tell yourself the story had a simpler moral. You could reassure yourself that you would have seen it coming, that you would have been different, that civilization's end was the result of some peculiar and avoidable mistake, rather than the logical culmination of a civilization that had been making the wrong choices, slowly and cheerfully, for generations. The more you sit with the mystery of the Great War, the less comfortable that comfort becomes. And Fallout, at its best, seems to want you to feel exactly that. The warm glow of the 1950s aesthetic, the cheerful music, the smiling mascots. It is not just decoration. It is the costume that catastrophe wears when it wants to be invited in. The world of Fallout is ours. Just rotated slightly, pointed toward a different end. The details change, the conclusion doesn't. Section 3. The Dunwich Horror, something older than the bombs. There is a building in the southwestern corner of Fallout 3's capital wasteland that most players walk past on their way to somewhere more obviously interesting. It sits alone on a blasted heath, surrounded by rocky ground and a feeling of wrongness that the game struggles to fully articulate with its geometry and lighting. The approach is unremarkable. Another ruined pre-war structure, another set of faded signs, another location that has been left to decay under a gray and radioactive sky. Raiders avoid it. Scavengers avoid it. The man you meet nearby, Ronald Laren at Girdershade, will mention it almost reluctantly if you ask, describing it as a strange place that unsettles him in ways he cannot quite explain. The building is called Dunwich. If you know your literary horror, the name alone is enough to make your skin prickle slightly. HP. Lovecraft's 1929 story, The Dunwich Horror, is one of the foundational texts of cosmic horror fiction. The idea that the universe contains entities so vast, so alien, so utterly indifferent to human existence, that the mere knowledge of them is enough to drive a person mad. Lovecraft's Dunwich is a decaying Massachusetts village, haunted by something ancient and malevolent that has been sleeping beneath the hills, waiting. Bethesda's Dunwich is a decaying pre-war office building, haunted by something ancient and malevolent that has been sleeping in the earth beneath it, waiting. The parallel is not subtle. It is not meant to be. What makes the Dunwich building remarkable is not the reference itself. Bethesda games are full of literary references, but the depth of the story it hides, and the way it asks you to piece that story together from fragments that were never meant to be a neat narrative. The building has 3 distinct levels, and each one peels back another layer of something that started as corporate history and ends as something far stranger. The first audio logs you find belong to a man named Jaime, who has come to the capital wasteland looking for his father. The father, Jaime tells you in a tired voice, had become a little nuts and was heading south with the goddamn book. The book is never identified by title, but by the time you reach the building's depths, you understand what it must have been: a grimoire, an old and terrible text, the kind of thing that should have been burned long ago. As you descend, the building begins to behave strangely. Items move on their own. Footsteps sound in distant corridors when there is nothing there to make them. More unsettling still, the game begins to trigger hallucinations, brief, disorienting flashes where the environment shifts to a pre-war setting, where you see a figure in clean clothes walking through a hallway that should be nothing but rubble, and when the vision clears, a glowing feral ghoul stands exactly where the figure was. The building is showing you echoes of its own past, as if the walls themselves are saturated with some residual energy that bleeds through time. Jaime's final audio log, recorded in the building's deepest level, is nothing coherent. It is the sound of a man who has gone somewhere beyond the capacity of ordinary language to follow. He speaks of temples, of feasts, of the return of someone named Abdul. He says the name Al-Hazred several times, his voice cycling between terror and reverence. In H.P. Lovecraft's mythos, Abdul-Hazred was the name of the mad Arab who wrote the Necronomicon, the most famous fictional forbidden text in all of horror literature. The voice near the obelisk in the building's lowest chamber whispers the same name over and over, in a register that sits just below the threshold of comfortable hearing. At the center of it all is the obelisk. A stone pillar in a cave beneath the office complex, ringed with what appear to be human skulls, with a humanoid figure seemingly trying to push its way out of the stone itself. The obelisk is the physical focus of whatever force exists in this place, a nexus for an entity the game never names directly, but whose presence saturates every room you have walked through. The entity's name, pieced together from the building's terminal entries and from the Point Lookout DLC questline, appears to be Ugg Qualtoth. The Dunwich Borers LLC, the company that owned this building and had been running excavation operations throughout the Capital Wasteland region, was founded by a man named Richard Dunwich, and the Dunwich family, as you can trace through their connection to the Black Hall family of Point Lookout, had been worshipping this entity for generations. The company's legitimate mining operations were a way to fund their real project, which was excavation in the most ancient and terrible sense of the word. They were digging towards something. The Point Lookout DLC extends the thread further. A man named Obadiah Blackhall is looking for a book called the Kriv Bekni, a grimoire made of strange leather that his family has been passing down for generations, and which has recently gone missing. The quest he sends you on eventually reveals that the Blackhall family has ancient ties to the Dunwich family, and that both bloodlines have been involved with Ugqual-Toth for far longer than the American timeline extends. The book is connected to the obelisk. The obelisk is connected to whatever sleeps beneath the wasteland. And whatever sleeps beneath the wasteland was not created by nuclear radiation, or the forced evolutionary virus, or any of the other scientific explanations that Fallout usually offers for its horrors. It was already there. In Fallout 4, Bethesda returned to the Dunwich mythology with a location called Dunwich Borers, a massive marble quarry to the northwest of the map, occupied by a raider gang called the Forged. On the surface, it looks like exactly what it claims to be, an abandoned industrial excavation site, scarred by blasting and drilling, full of rust and collapsed machinery. But as you descend through its levels, the familiar sensations return. Hallucinations, whispers, visions of the past that feel too specific, too coherent to be random neural noise. In one of the deepest sections of the quarry, a vision plays out before you. A man with a ritual knife standing before a group of kneeling, handcuffed people. The scene has the quality of a recurring memory, something ancient enough to have worn grooves in the fabric of the place. When you return to the present, the kneeling figures have become ghouls. Whatever power the Dunwich family was channeling, it left permanent marks on the people who were present at its rituals. Further down still, at the very bottom of the quarry's flooded lower levels, players discovered something that took years after Fallout 4's release to fully document. Beneath the water, barely visible through the murk, is a massive stone face. Its features are strange and archaic, carved in a style that predates any American architectural tradition, and it is enormous. The crane positioned above the pool suggests that the Dunwich Borers Corporation was actively trying to excavate this figure before the bombs fell, that they were specifically digging for it, that the whole quarry operation was designed around this one discovery. The face closely matches the decorative sculptures found throughout the Commonwealth, on building facades and monuments, giving those Art Deco design elements a sudden and retroactive horror. Was all of that pre-war ornamentation a form of unconscious worship? Were the architects of Boston's pre-war skyline somehow influenced by something they could not have consciously named? And then Fallout 76 added one more piece to the puzzle. In the depths of the Lucky Hole mine in Appalachia, a creature called the Interloper waits in the darkness. It is enormous. It is strange. Its appearance suggests something between a tree and a body. Bark-like skin over a vaguely humanoid form, tentacle-like appendages framing a face that should not be there. It does not attack unless provoked. It simply sits in its deep underground chamber, surrounded by the offerings and shrines of a cult that has been worshipping it for longer than anyone can reliably trace. The decorative stone faces in the Interloper's chamber are the same ones found at Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4. The model is shared. The visual language is consistent. What does this mean? At the minimum, it means that Bethesda has been building, across 3 separate games and multiple DLC releases spanning more than a decade, a coherent hidden mythology. The Fallout universe contains entities ancient, non-human, cosmically indifferent, that were present long before any of the human history that the games describe. The resource wars, the nuclear exchange, the vaults, the factions, the entire post-apocalyptic drama, all of it takes place against a backdrop of something older and stranger that has been quietly wading through human history, occasionally noticed, occasionally worshipped, occasionally disturbed. None of this is confirmed. None of it is presented as the definitive lore. The Dunwich thread is always handled as suggestion, as implication, as the feeling of a wrong note in an otherwise familiar song. The games never commit to a cosmology. They simply leave these pieces scattered in the dark and let you decide how to arrange them, which is, honestly, the most frightening approach possible, because suggestion is always more disturbing than explanation. The thing you almost see is always worse than the thing you see clearly. The Dunwich building works precisely because it refuses to resolve. It gives you enough to understand that something genuine and terrible is happening, and then it leaves you with that understanding and no reassurance whatsoever. In the southwest corner of the capital wasteland, in the quiet, in the dark, the obelisk waits. The name Al-Hazred drifts through the air like smoke. And deep in the earth, older than the bombs and older than the nation that built the building above it and older perhaps than any of the human stories that the Fallout series has been telling, something sits with its eyes closed in what might be sleep or might be patience. The distinction matters if you think about it long enough. Section 4. The vaults. What Vault-Tec actually built. There are 122 known vaults. That number comes from the official Fallout lore, confirmed across multiple sources. 122 sealed underground bunkers distributed across the continental United States, each one constructed to house between 500 and 1,000 residents, each one equipped with everything a self-sustaining community would need to survive the end of the world. Clean water recyclers, food growing facilities, medical bays, schools, common areas designed to the exact specifications needed to maintain baseline psychological well-being in an enclosed environment. And in most of them, a secret experiment. Only 17 of the 122 vaults were what Vault-Tec publicly claimed all of them were. Genuine shelters, run transparently, designed to actually preserve human life without ulterior motive. The remaining 105 were laboratories. The residents of those vaults were, without their knowledge, the subjects of experiments ranging from mildly inconvenient to actively murderous. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment. Not 17 out of 122 were experiments. 105 out of 122 were experiments. The entire Project Safehouse program, the national effort to build shelters, funded by the government, marketed to the public as a humanitarian initiative, sold to individual families for real money with real promises of safety was, in its fundamental character, a colossal fraud. The vaults were not rescue boats, they were Petri dishes. The question of why Vault-Tec structured its program this way has several overlapping answers, none of them comforting. The most immediate answer is that Vault-Tec's corporate leadership believed the nuclear war was coming and wanted to know how humanity would survive in controlled environments. What were the optimal social structures for rebuilding civilization? What were the psychological effects of long-term isolation on different population compositions? How would people behave when their resources were artificially constrained? Or when their governance structure was secretly manipulated? Or when their information about the outside world was falsified? These are actually legitimate scientific questions in the abstract. The problem is that legitimate science does not typically answer them by sealing uninformed human beings in boxes and modifying their environment without consent. The problem is that Vault-Tec did not approach this as scientists. They approached it as a corporation, as an entity whose primary obligation was not to the people in its care, but to its investors and its project goals. And then there is the deeper answer, the one the Fallout TV series made most explicit, the Enclave, which was quietly the shadow government of the United States, was using Vault-Tec's data to plan for a future in which they would re-emerge and rebuild civilization according to their own very specific vision. The vaults were the training ground for that future. The Enclave wanted to understand how survivors behaved, how populations could be managed, how new social structures could be engineered from scratch. All of this information would eventually flow back to them to be used in the reconstruction they intended to impose on a post-war world. The experiments themselves range from the grim to the grotesque to the almost absurdly dark. Vault 11 inches, the Mojave told its residents that unless they sacrificed one person from their population each year, the entire vault would be destroyed. The residents, faced with this impossible moral equation, built a political philosophy around it over generations, forming factions, holding elections, running candidates on platforms of self-sacrifice. Eventually, the whole system collapsed into violence, and only 5 survivors emerged from the final conflict. They discovered, in the Vault's computer system, that the sacrifice requirement had been a test, and that they had been promised rewards for defying it, but by the time they learned this, it was far too late for the hundreds who had already died. The 5 survivors could not live with what they had been part of. 4 of them committed suicide in the Vault's computer room. one left, and whatever became of them, the game only hints at obliquely. Vault 75 inches the Commonwealth operated beneath Malden Middle School. Parents who tried to save their families on the day of the bombs were told by Vault Tech representatives that the vault had space only for their children. The children would be safe. The parents would need to find other shelter. What actually happened inside Vault 75 was that the children were sorted by fitness, intelligence, and physical aptitude, and the ones deemed unsuitable were executed before they reached the age of 18. The ones who survived were turned into soldiers, super soldiers by the standards of a post-nuclear world, trained and conditioned and shaped for some purpose that is never fully explained. Vault 106 inches, the Capital Wasteland pumped psychoactive drugs through its air filtration system for 10 days after sealing. The terminals record that the overseer knew about this and instructed security personnel to observe the effects rather than intervene. 200 years later, when the lone wanderer enters Vault 106, the residents are still alive, still inhabiting the vault, still deeply affected by the substances they were exposed to generations ago. And the lone wanderer experiences their own hallucinations inside the vault, suggesting that the drugs were either extremely long-lasting or that something about the vault's atmosphere continues to function as designed. Vault 92 was populated entirely with classical musicians and told it had been designed for artistic preservation. In reality, it was running experiments in sonic stimulation, specifically in whether certain sound frequencies could be used to trigger violent behavior in people. The experiment worked. Periodically, residents would be subjected to broadcast white noise stimuli that would cause them to experience violent rage. The vault's collapse was total and bloody, and by the time the lone wanderer finds it, the recordings that survive tell a story of a place that went from a concert hall to a charnel house in a matter of months. Vault 87 was the site of FEV experiments. The forced evolutionary virus, the mutagen that creates supermutants, was tested here on unwilling residents, transforming them into the creatures that the lone wanderer spends much of Fallout 3 trying to survive. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland trace directly back to Vault 87, meaning that one of the primary post-war threats to human survival in the region was manufactured by the same corporation that was supposedly trying to preserve humanity. Vault 112 housed its residents in a state of suspended animation and connected them to a virtual reality simulation. The overseer of Vault 112 was a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun, and the simulation he ran was not the comfortable paradise he had promised his residents. Braun had absolute control over the virtual environment, and he used that control in the way that people with absolute power over other people have always tended to use it. He tortured his residents. He gave them painful deaths and resurrected them and did it again, for years and decades and centuries, because nothing in the simulation was real except the experience of it, and that meant nothing was off-limits. The lone wanderer is drawn into Braun's simulation as part of the quest to find their father, and the sequence they experience inside Vault 112 is one of the most quietly disturbing moments in any Fallout game. The idyllic 1950s village of Tranquility Lane, where the residents live out an endless suburban dream at Braun's direction, has a horror beneath its pleasant surface that builds slowly. Braun gives the lone wanderer increasingly dark tasks. The residents are confused and dissociated, unable to fully recognize their own unreality. And Braun himself, accessed through a terminal hidden inside an old abandoned house, speaks in the calm, methodical register of someone who has had complete power for so long that the idea of ethical limits has become genuinely incomprehensible to him. Vault 111, the one the sole survivor wakes up in at the start of Fallout 4, was designed around cryogenic storage. The residents were told they were being frozen as a precaution, that they would be woken up in a few years when conditions on the surface improved. They were never woken up. The Vault-Tec staff who managed the cryopods ran their own internal experiments and then apparently abandoned the facility when their resources ran low, leaving the frozen residents to remain frozen indefinitely. Most of them died in their pods over the decades, their cryogenic systems failing without maintenance. The sole survivor, protected by a specific malfunction that kept their pods sealed, is one of the very few who survived long enough to be woken up 210 years after going under. What makes the Vault experiments particularly disturbing from a narrative standpoint is that most of the information about them is contained in documents, the the residents themselves were never allowed to see. The overseers received sealed orders. The staff had access codes that residents did not. The whole architecture of the vault system was designed to maintain information asymmetry to ensure that the people living inside these sealed environments never knew enough about their situation to make genuinely informed choices about it. This is not incidental to the horror. It is the horror. The vault experiments are disturbing not merely because of what was done to people, but because of the structure of deception that surrounded what was done to people. Families paid real money for vault spaces. They made plans. They said goodbye to neighbors who hadn't gotten spots, feeling guilty and lucky and maybe slightly smug. They walked into those clean, well-lit corridors, believing they were the fortunate ones, the survivors, the people that civilization had chosen to preserve. And they were chosen, just not in the way they thought. The vaults are Fallout's most direct statement about what the pre-war world actually was, a system in which those with power treated those without it as resources to be managed, experiments to be run, problems to be contained. The aesthetic warmth of the 1950s setting, the cheerful Vault Boy mascot with his thumbs up and his easy smile, is not an accident. It is the face that exploitation wears when it wants to be welcomed in. It is the last image visible before the door seals shut. Section 5. The Mysterious Stranger. A ghost in all the Wasteland's histories. He appears without warning. You are in the middle of a fight, using the Vault-Tec assisted targeting system, lining up your shots with the practiced efficiency of someone who has survived long enough to understand that the Wasteland rewards precision. And then the music comes, that brief, distinctive guitar sting, 2 or 3 notes that exist nowhere else in the Fallout soundscape, and a man in a fedora and a worn trench coat materializes at the edge of your vision. He fires a single shot from his revolver, turns, and disappears. He has no combat animation arc. He does not holster his weapon, does not turn and walk away, does not run. He simply ceases to be present in the space where he just was. If you were looking directly at him when he vanished, he was there, and then he was not. The Mysterious Stranger has appeared in every mainline Fallout game. He shows up as a perk in Fallout 1 and 2, as a random combat assistance event in Fallout 3 and New Vegas and 4, as a vault visitor in Fallout Shelter, and as an event trigger in Fallout 76. He always wears the same coat and hat. He always uses a high-powered revolver. He always appears and disappears in the same specific, unresolvable way. No one in any of the Fallout games, across all their accumulated hours of dialogue and terminal entries and holotapes, has been able to explain who he is. The single exception is Nick Valentine, the detective companion in Fallout 4, who has an active case file on the Mysterious Stranger in his office. The case file contains everything Nick has been able to establish. The Stranger has been operating in both the capital Wasteland and the Commonwealth. His appearances date back at least as far as the events of the original Fallout games. He is described in the file, without apparent irony, as odd and eldritch. Nick's frustration when the Stranger appears during combat and then vanishes before Nick can approach him is one of the genuinely charming moments in Fallout. For here is this world-weary detective who has lived through 2 centuries and countless horrors, and this one specific thing still gets under his skin. The Fallout 3 official game guide, which occupies a space somewhere between game documentation and in-universe artifact, describes the Mysterious Stranger as an odd and eldritch entity said to appear and aid you in combat before you draw your dying breath. The word eldritch is not accidental. It is a very specific literary term, associated most strongly with Lovecraftian horror, denoting something strange and supernatural in a way that suggests ancient, alien, or unknowable origin. The guide is suggesting, with the confidence of something that was never expected to be analyzed closely, that the Mysterious Stranger is not merely a human eccentricity. He is something more fundamental than that. Fallout. New Vegas introduces the single most compelling clue about the Stranger's nature, buried in an NPC encounter that most players complete quickly and forget. East of El Dorado Dry Lake, a man named the Lonesome Drifter sits at a campfire playing guitar. He is sad in the specific, comfortable way of people who have made their peace with their sadness. If you speak to him at length and navigate the conversation carefully, he will tell you that his father was a mysterious man who was a stranger to his own family, and that the only thing he was left with was a gun. The gun is a unique .44 Magnum called the Mysterious Magnum, and when you draw it, it plays the same guitar sting that accompanies the mysterious stranger's appearances. When you holster it, a chord sounds. The music is the confirmation. The Lonesome Drifter's father is, or was, the mysterious stranger, which means the stranger had a family at some point, which means he was, at some point, fully human. Whatever he is now, eldritch entity, timeless guardian, something that should, by all rights, have aged and died, but has not. He was once a man with a child who waited for him, and a gun that remembers the notes of his arrival. There are several fan theories that have achieved something approaching canonical weight through their elegance and how well they fit the available evidence. One is that the mysterious stranger is literally death, or death's representative not in a supernatural metaphysical sense, but in the practical sense that he appears specifically at moments when you are about to die, pulls you back from the edge, and then departs. He functions as a guardian angel, in the same way that the Fallout 3 guide describes him, except without the religious connotations. He simply appears when you need him most. Another theory, building on the connection to Mark Twain's unfinished novella, The Mysterious Stranger, suggests that the character is a more cosmic entity testing or observing humanity. Twain's mysterious stranger is identified as Satan's nephew, a being from outside human moral frameworks who appears to specific people at specific moments to observe or manipulate events. The Fallout character shares his name and his habit of appearing and disappearing, and the 44 Magnum of later games is a detail that corresponds to the novella's version in some interpretations. A third reading, perhaps the most haunting, is simply that the mysterious stranger does not have an explanation, because he cannot be explained that his existence in the Fallout universe is one of the things that is simply true without having a cause. The way that certain mysteries in real life resist rational resolution, the wasteland has ghosts. It has the residue of the old world clinging to certain places and certain people in ways that no Geiger counter can measure. The stranger is one of those residues. He wanders through the games of the series the way a recurring dream wanders through sleep, present and purposeful and utterly irreducible. In Fallout 4, his coat and hat are no longer unique to him. You can find versions of the mysterious stranger outfit in the wasteland, worn by mannequins and raiders and the general population of post-nuclear fashion. The stranger himself in Fallout 4 is middle-aged, with a mustache, his coat buttoned rather than tied at the front. He looks more settled somehow, more real, as if the years between New Vegas and the Commonwealth had made him incrementally more substantial. But he still vanishes. He still leaves no trace. Nick Valentine still cannot catch him. Whatever the mysterious stranger is, across the decades of the series and the centuries of in-game time he has been active, he remains precisely what his name describes. A stranger, mysterious, appearing in the histories of everyone he helps and belonging permanently to none of them. There is something genuinely comforting about that image, if you approach it from the right angle. Something in the ruins that is always on your side. Something that shows up exactly when you need it most and asks nothing of you afterward. In a setting that contains as much genuine darkness as the Fallout wasteland does, the mysterious stranger is one of its stranger and more beautiful anomalies, a ghost with a purpose, a shadow with a revolver, appearing at the edge of your worst moments, and then returning to wherever it is that things like him go when they are not needed. The guitar plays, the shot is fired, the figure turns, and then he is gone. Section 6. The Interloper and the Cosmic Horror Beneath Appalachia. West Virginia in 2102, 4 years after the bombs fell, is a place of particular and specific beauty. The forests of Appalachia are still growing, radiation-touched but intact in ways that the more thoroughly devastated regions of the country are not. The hills have a quality to them that predates the nuclear catastrophe by millions of years. That geological permanence of old mountains which have watched the comings and goings of many small civilizations without particular concern. There are rivers and lakes and mines, and, if you know where to look, there are shrines built from roots and bones at the edges of the woods. Fallout 76 was, on its release in 2018, a controversial entry in the series for many reasons. But embedded in its version of Appalachia were some of the most genuinely strange and carefully constructed pieces of lore that Bethesda had produced in years, and much of that strangeness clusters around the figure of the Mothman. The Mothman is real West Virginia folklore. Point Pleasant, the real town that exists in real West Virginia, has a Mothman museum and a Mothman statue and an annual Mothman festival. The legend goes back to 1966 and 1967, a period when people in the Point Pleasant area reported seeing a large, winged creature with glowing red eyes, often in connection with a series of strange events that culminated in the collapse of the Silver Bridge in December 1967, which killed 46 people. Whether the Mothman was seen as a portent of disaster or its cause, whether it was a mass hallucination or a misidentified large bird or something genuinely anomalous, the mythology of it has been carefully preserved in the region's cultural memory. Fallout 76 takes the Mothman and makes it real in the most literal possible sense. The Mothman exists in Appalachia as a creature, appearing at night, watching from distances, with glowing eyes and colors that seem to mean different things, red-eyed variants that the Dim Ones faction considers divine, purple-eyed variants that the Enlightened faction considers the genuine article. The two factions interpret the same creature, or related creatures, through completely incompatible theological frameworks, and both of them are convinced the other is being deceived. What makes the Mothman genuinely interesting from a lore perspective is not the creature itself, but what the creature is connected to. In the depths of the Lucky Hole mine, accessible if you know where to look and willing to descend far enough, is a creature called the Interloper. Art director Nathan Perkypile, who designed it, has confirmed in interviews that it was something he essentially included as a personal project, a kind of hidden gift to players willing to explore the game deeply enough. The Interloper was named by the community. The game files refer to the creature with the internal designation Gutpooker, which is considerably less dignified than the name that stuck, and its nature is explored, entirely through environmental storytelling and holotapes. The Interloper is an enormous dormant creature, something between a tree and a god, sitting at the bottom of the mine in a chamber whose walls have been decorated with offerings by a cult that has been worshipping it for longer than any living person can remember. Its surface resembles stripped bark. It has tentacle-like appendages around what should be its face. If you hit it, it bleeds. If you approach it, nothing happens, because it is not awake, or it is not hungry, or it has chosen to do nothing. And in this context, those three possibilities are equally terrifying. The holotapes around the Interloper's chamber tell pieces of a story. Jeff Lane, a member of the Mothman cult who arrived at the mine separately from the rest of his group, describes being called to it in dreams and visions. He speaks of a mad storyteller who confirmed the Interloper's existence, of a calling that came in visions more real than the senses, of being chosen as a conduit of the unknowable. In his last recorded message, he declares that the hidden reality will finally become manifest. Whatever happened to Jeff Lane after that recording, the Interloper's chamber gives you the answer in the way that environmental storytelling does better than any cutscene. It shows you the bones. The Interloper never does anything during normal gameplay. It sits. Cults worship it. Cultists bring it offerings. Occasionally, the mine produces strange sounds in its depths, and deep below the surface of West Virginia, something waits with apparent patience. The connection between the Interloper and the Dunwich mythology from Fallout 3 and 4 is what transforms this from an interesting individual mystery into a pattern. Both involve something ancient beneath the earth. Both are associated with human cults that predate the Great War. Both use the same distinctive stone face imagery in their religious iconography. Both are framed through the language of Lovecraftian horror. Entities so alien that human minds cannot contain them. So old that human history is a brief footnote in their existence. So powerful that even proximity to them warps perception and sanity. The question the games never answer, can never answer, because answering it would damage what makes it work, is whether these entities are connected. Whether Ugh-Qualtoth and the Interloper and whatever was being excavated at Dunwich Borers are different names for the same thing. Different faces of a single cosmic presence that has been sleeping under the continent since before the first human beings arrived, or whether they are separate entities who share only the common characteristic of being ancient and incomprehensible, and patient in the way that mountains are patient. The games scatter their clues and leave the synthesis to you. What they all share is the implication that the post-nuclear wasteland is not the worst thing in the Fallout universe. The nuclear war, the vaults, the super mutants, the factions, all of that is a human-scale horror, the result of human choices made badly over human timescales. But underneath it, in the mines and the basements and the deep places of the earth, there is something that predates every one of those choices and will outlast every one of their consequences. The bombs did not create every horror in Fallout's world. Some of them were already here. Some of them were here long before the first human hand shaped the first stone into the first tool and looked up at the sky and thought, for the first time, that perhaps the world was something that could be understood. Fallout 76's Appalachia is beautiful in the way that any forest is beautiful. Green and alive and indifferent to the human drama playing out within it. The Mothman watches from the trees. The interloper sleeps in its mine. The cultists build their shrines of roots and bones, and leave their offerings and chant in the dark. And in the Lucky Hole mine, so far down that the surface is just a memory, something occasionally shifts in the deep silence. Section 7. Nick Valentine, the Institute, and the question that has no comfortable answer. In Diamond City, in a cluttered agency tucked between buildings that were once baseball stadium vendor stands, there is a detective who has been waiting since 2287 for someone to give him a new case. His name is Nick Valentine, and he is, in a very specific technical sense, not real. He is a synthetic human, a highly advanced android created by the organization known as the Institute, an underground research facility staffed by the descendants of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The Institute built synths to serve as a labor force, a research capability, and eventually as something approaching a societal project, replacing humans in certain roles with manufactured approximations. Nick's particular case is unusual even within the Institute's history. He is what they call a Generation 2 synth, or rather, he was supposed to be. His body is of that older, more obviously mechanical generation, the type whose exposed joints and visible framework make their artificial nature unmistakable. But his memories and personality are of a different origin. When the Institute developed the technology to transfer human consciousness into a synthetic chassis, they used Nick Valentine's memories, the actual memories of a pre-war detective named Nicholas Valentine, who volunteered as a data donor as their template. The original Nick Valentine died. The synth that carries his memories woke up in a garbage dump outside the Institute with no explanation and no immediate way to understand what he was. He had Nick's feelings for a woman named Jennifer Lands, who had been murdered before the war. He had Nick's professional ethics, his instincts, his speech patterns. He had decades of memories that belonged to a man who no longer existed. He did not know, at first, whether he was Nick Valentine or whether he was something that had been made to think it was Nick Valentine, and the gap between those two possibilities is where one of Fallout 4's most thoughtful character arcs lives. Nick eventually made peace with the ambiguity in the way that only someone who has thought about it long and carefully enough can. He decided that the memories were real enough to honor, the ethics were real enough to act on, and the identity was real enough to maintain. He set up his detective agency. He helped people. He kept files on mysteries the wasteland had given him, including the mysterious stranger. He built a life that was genuinely his, even if the foundations of it were manufactured. The Institute, which created Nick and hundreds of other synths, is one of Fallout 4's central mysteries and its most uncomfortable antagonist. Unlike the Enclave, which was nakedly militaristic and genocidal in its ambitions, the Institute presents itself as the future as the one organization with both the resources and the vision to advance human knowledge beyond the wasteland's immediate survivalist concerns. Its scientists are not cartoon villains. They have genuine intellectual curiosity. They produce real breakthroughs. They believe, most of them, that what they are doing is for the ultimate good of humanity. What they do with that belief is what makes them disturbing. The Institute replaces people, not in a coordinated campaign of extermination, but quietly, selectively, using their synths to substitute for specific individuals in specific communities. The reason given is always research. They need to study human social structures. They need agents in the surface world. They need to understand conditions above ground. The effect is that people in the Commonwealth live with a persistent, low-grade terror of being secretly replaced, of looking at someone they have known for years, and wondering whether they are looking at the original person or at a copy made by an underground laboratory. This fear is not irrational. The Institute has, in documented cases, done exactly this. Synth doubles have been placed in communities. Real people have been taken. What happens to the originals is, for most of the game, unclear, and the way the game withholds that information is careful and deliberate. The synth question in Fallout 4 is a genuinely philosophical puzzle rather than just a narrative one. The most advanced Institute synths Generation 3, the ones who look fully human, have enough cognitive complexity that their capacity for experience is functionally indistinguishable from that of biological humans. They feel, they form relationships, they have preferences, fears, dreams, and the metaphorical sense of things they hope for. When a synth escapes from the Institute and lives free in the wasteland for years, building a life and a sense of self and a network of people they care about, at what point does the question of their origin become irrelevant? Nick Valentine is one answer to that question. Dogmeat is not involved in the Institute. Hancock is not a synth. The companion line in Fallout 4 includes multiple perspectives on the synthetic question, and none of them provide easy comfort. The Railroad, the faction dedicated to freeing synths and helping them escape to new lives with new identities, treats the question with moral clarity. Synths are people, and people deserve freedom. Full stop. The Brotherhood of Steel, arriving in the Commonwealth with their power armor and their absolutist ideology, treats synths as abominations machines pretending to be human, threats to the purity and safety of actual humanity. The Minutemen, the Settlers faction, are too focused on survival to have a fully developed position on synthetic personhood. And the Institute itself views the question through the lens of property synths are products, expensive products, and products do not have rights. The player, as the sole survivor, gets to choose. But the game's design makes every choice uncomfortable. You cannot join every faction. You cannot save everyone. And whoever you side with, whoever you call the hero of the Commonwealth, something genuine and terrible is lost. Nick Valentine, in his cluttered office, working his cold cases, has been sitting with this question for years before you arrive. He has an answer, he is a person, and he acts accordingly, but he holds it lightly enough to acknowledge the question itself. He does not pretend certainty he does not have. The Institute's underground compound in the glowing sea, accessed through a teleportation system that the Brotherhood desperately wants, and the Railroad desperately fears, is a marvel of clinical design. White corridors, efficient systems, a population of people who were born there and have never seen the sky. The Institute's children and grandchildren, growing up underground, working in their specialized departments, living lives that are genuinely good by many measures and that are also, from a certain angle, a smaller and more self-imposed version of the vault system they were originally designed to study. There is a line in Fallout 4 spoken by a senior Institute scientist, delivered in a tone of absolute sincere belief, that perfectly encapsulates what makes the Institute so disturbing. Mankind as it currently exists is not worth saving. They are not saying this to be cruel. They mean it as a scientific conclusion. And they are working, with genuine intelligence and enormous resources, toward the project of replacing mankind as it currently exists with something they have decided would be better. This is, in the most immediate and concrete sense, what the bombs tried to do and failed. The Great War was also, in its way, an attempt to clear the field and start over. The Institute has simply found a more targeted method. Nick Valentine, outside in the city built from stadium ruins, takes his next case. He files his notes. He keeps his coffee warm. He is, in every way that actually matters, a real person navigating the same world as everyone else. The question of what he is, technically, is the wrong question. He decided this long ago. Whether the wasteland agrees is another matter entirely. Section 8. The aliens' watchers from above and what they may have done. There is a radio signal in the northern capital wasteland. If you are wandering in that direction and your Pip-Boy is set to scan, you will pick it up a static heavy transmission, garbled and difficult to parse, with something in it that is not quite language, but is not quite not language either. The signal traces to a downed spacecraft, a small recon vessel that has crashed through the roof of a ruined house and buried itself in the hillside outside. The alien body in the cockpit is already dead. The ship is definitely extraterrestrial. This is your introduction to the Zetans, and if you have the Mothership Zeta DLC installed, it is also the beginning of Fallout 3's strangest and most divisive story. Alien life has been a threat in Fallout since the beginning. The very first game included an alien blaster as a rare and powerful weapon, a reward for finding a crashed UFO in the desert, a moment of dark humor, in keeping with the series' general attitude toward absurdity. Fallout 2 continued the tradition, and so did every Fallout after it. Each game has a crashed flying saucer, a stranded alien, a piece of technology that is demonstrably not from any human civilization. Mothership Zeta takes this background detail and makes it the foreground. The lone wanderer is abducted by an alien spacecraft, the Mothership Zeta, and must escape from it by working with a small group of fellow abductees, a girl named Sally, who has been aboard the ship for decades and knows its systems well, a samurai named Toshiro Kago, who was apparently abducted from pre-war Japan, a wastelander named Soma, and an Enclave soldier named Elliot Terkorian. The Zetons themselves, the aliens aboard the ship, are small, gray, vaguely humanoid in the classic science fiction tradition. They abduct humans and other creatures from Earth, study them, experiment on them, and store them in suspended animation in a process that has troubling resonance with the vault system operating far below them. The ship's archives contain relics from across human history: Nuka-Cola bottles, Vault-Tec posters, pre-war newspapers. They have been watching for a very long time. The most inflammatory piece of lore in Mothership Zeta, the detail that a segment of the Fallout community has never quite forgiven, is the implication that the aliens may have had a hand in causing the Great War. A terminal entry on the ship suggests that Zetans obtained nuclear launch codes. An audio log seems to indicate that soldiers were launching missiles while under alien mental influence. The implication, left just vague enough to be deniable, is that the nuclear exchange of the 23rd of October 2077 was not purely a human decision, that somewhere in the chain of events, the Zetans nudged something in a particular direction. Whether you find this a fascinating expansion of the lore, or a frustrating insertion of science fiction into what you felt was a more grounded post-apocalyptic setting, depends largely on what you think Fallout is, fundamentally, about. The community remains divided on this point. The creators of the original games were divided on it too. Tim Kaine, who co-created Fallout, has expressed his discomfort with the aliens influenced the Great War reading in interviews, noting that it shifts moral responsibility away from humanity in ways he finds thematically wrong. Bethesda went ahead and built it into the DLC anyway, albeit carefully enough that it remains a theory rather than a confirmed fact. What is interesting from a purely archaeological perspective, the kind of perspective that this particular video is interested in, is what might have been. A Bethesda developer blog, combined with analysis of the game's internal quest files, reveals that there was an entire main quest related to alien activity that was cut from Fallout 3's development. The quest files were numbered sequentially for side quests, running from MS1 through to MS6, and then jumping to MS8 with MS7 entirely absent from the final game. What existed as MS7 can be partially reconstructed from the surviving dialogue files. It would have involved the Brotherhood of Steel and their breakaway faction, the Outcasts, a pre-war alien conspiracy, and something about an ancient alien presence connected to the Capital Wasteland's history in ways more central than any of the DLC ultimately explored. The quest was cut entirely, with no in-game trace, but enough of the structure survives in the files to suggest that the alien plotline was originally intended to be considerably more central to Fallout 3's main story than the standalone Mothership Zeta DLC it eventually became. The Zetans archive room, accessible in the DLC, is the single most visually striking argument that their role in Fallout's history is substantial. It contains relics spanning centuries of human history, objects that could only have been collected through systematic, long-term observation of the planet's surface. A bottle of Nuka-Cola from the 2040s, a samurai sword from feudal Japan, weapons from multiple wars. The breadth of the collection implies that the Zetans have been watching Earth not since the nuclear age, but for much, much longer. They are not visitors who arrived in response to the growing conflict. They are watchers who were present long before any of Fallout's human history, observing with the patient detachment of scientists who have all the time in the universe, or at least the patience of scientists who have all the time in the universe. Whether they are entirely passive observers, or whether they intervene, and in what direction, and to what end, these questions live in the space between the DLC's confirmed events and the cut quest's ghost. Mothership Zeta is an ending without a beginning, a chapter pulled from the middle of a story that was never fully told. Above the capital wasteland, in its clean white corridors and its amber glow, the Zetan ship keeps its archive. The evidence of its long vigil is preserved in rows of careful glass cases. The humans who briefly escaped it, the lone wanderer among them, return to the surface they came from. The ship itself, if you return after the DLC is complete, is still there. Still accessible, still full of its ancient records, still waiting for what comes next. Section 9. Stories Nobody Found: The Hidden Lives of the Wasteland. There is a camp in Fallout 3 that most players never find. It is located beyond the southern edge of the map, in a region that the game does not really want you to go. No quest sends you there. No marker directs you toward it. It exists simply because the designer who built it decided that the story needed to be there, in that specific location, even if only the players design it enough to push past the game's intended boundaries would ever encounter it. The camp belongs to a woman named Isabella Proud. Isabella was a scientist, a researcher who had become fascinated with feral ghouls, the fully degenerated, animalistic variety of ghoul, which most wastelanders simply kill on sight. While the mainstream scientific thinking in the capital wasteland dismissed feral ghouls as lost causes, as former humans who had regressed beyond any possibility of cognition or recovery, Isabella believed otherwise. She thought there was something still functioning in them, some trace of the person they had been, and she spent years tracking them, observing them, taking notes in a terminal at her camp with the kind of precise, passionate attention that distinguished serious researchers in any era. Her notes describe behavioral patterns, social structures, moments of what appeared to be rudimentary cooperation among feral ghoul groups. She was building a case, carefully and alone, for a more complex understanding of what happened to people when radiation pushed them over the edge from the sentient ghoul condition into the feral state. If you follow the references in her terminal, you can trace the locations she described, find the sites she was studying. You can also find her. Isabella and her research partner Jason died somewhere in the field, their bodies in the positions of people who were simply overtaken by the creatures they were studying. The notes end. The research stops in its tracks. The camp is there when you find it, her terminal still running on whatever power source it has been drawing on, her research preserved in exactly the condition she left it. The wasteland preserved her intellectual work in the same way it preserved Nuka-Cola bottles and pre-war music indifferently, without comprehension, simply because the container was still intact. This is one of many hundreds of small, self-contained human stories scattered through Fallout's open worlds, and it represents something that the series does better than almost any other game franchise. The wasteland is not a backdrop for the player's story. It is full of other stories that happened without the player's involvement, that ended before the player arrived, that existed entirely independently of any quest marker or loot reward. Some of these stories have a dark humor to them. Near Boston Common in Fallout 4, stairs lead down to a basement bar. The interior recreates, with unsettling accuracy, the bar from the television program Cheers, the bottles on the wall, the long counter, the booths, and in their usual seats, the skeletons of Norm and Cliff Clavin sit where they always sat, among the skeletons of their friends and neighbors. Cliff is identifiable by the remnants of his postal uniform. The bar's in-game name is Prost, which is German for cheers. Whether this makes the reference heartbreaking or funny depends on which direction you look at it. In the same city, the ruins of the old Massachusetts Institute of Technology, now called CIT, contain a blackboard with a linear algebra problem on it. A skeleton in a janitor's uniform lies nearby. The problem is the same one that Matt Damon's character solves in Good Will Hunting, which was set in and around MIT and which is, depending on your perspective, either a warm tribute to a beloved film or a moment of quiet melancholy about the kind of institution that produced people capable of doing things like that, now reduced to a blackboard in a ruin. Not far from the Salem Museum of Witchcraft, there is a shipwreck. Inside the nearby boat, a skeleton lies next to a mutated dolphin in positions that directly replicate the death of Captain Quint in Jaws, the shark attack victim, the particular arrangement of bodies, even a shark cage visible in the water nearby. It is specific enough to be unmistakable, and placed far enough off the obvious path that finding it feels genuinely like a discovery rather than a highlight from a guided tour. In the Far Harbor DLC, set on an island off the coast of Maine, Two skeletons lie in the water near a shipwreck in the unmistakable pose of Jack and Rose at the end of Titanic. The Far Harbor DLC's setting, nautical, fog-drenched, saturated with maritime tragedy, makes the reference feel less like a joke than a genuine elegy for the kind of story that ends in the water. The Dunwich Borers location in Fallout 4, which we have already spent time with for its cosmic horror implications, contains a separate reference buried in its upper levels. A police chief's terminal contains a diary entry complaining about two officers, Willison, who destroys property, and Gibbs, who takes unnecessary risks. The last names, when rearranged, give you Willis and Gibson a nod to Bruce Willis in Die Hard and Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon, two 1980s action heroes whose screen personas were defined by exactly those traits. These Easter eggs are sometimes categorized separately from the real lore, as if one is serious and the other is frivolous. But there is a case to be made that they are the same project. The Fallout series has always been comfortable with tonal plurality. It can be genuinely philosophical about human nature in one corridor and making a Cheers reference in the next, and neither one undercuts the other. The jokes and the tragedies and the mysteries coexist in the same space because that is how life actually works, before and after the bombs. And then there are the stories that are harder to categorize, the ones that sit at the intersection of humor and genuine sadness. At the castle in Fallout 4, deep in the basement, you find General McGann, long dead, surrounded by his wine collection. Hidden in a broken wall is a chained skeleton, surrounded by empty bottles of a wine called Amontillado. This is a reference to Edgar Allan Poe's 1846 story, The Cask of Amontillado, in which a man takes revenge on an enemy by walling him in, alive in a wine cellar. The skeleton's position matches the story perfectly. Someone in the days before the war liked Poe enough to do this to someone else, or found the wine cellar and decided that fate had arranged itself into an acceptable literary reference, and either way, 200 years later, there it is. Fallout 4's Commonwealth is full of people who died in the middle of things that mattered to them. The scientist's notes, the artist's studio, the writer's manuscript that ends mid-sentence, the family photo on the bedside table of a house where every room tells a story of how normal things were and how fast they stopped being normal. The games do not always point these out. They do not always frame them as moments worth stopping for. They simply exist because the world that ended had people in it, and people have things they are in the middle of when the world ends. The cave north of Good Springs in New Vegas, where a shovel reveals a grave and the grave contains a knife that belonged to someone named Chance, and the knife is special, and the story of how it got there is told in fragments across the region. If you are looking for them, is perhaps the simplest and most effective version of this. Chance's knife, Chance's grave. No quest marker, no reward beyond the knife itself. Just the presence of a person who existed and left something of themselves behind in the earth, waiting for someone patient enough to dig. The wasteland is enormous, and most of it is empty. But the emptiness is not absence. It is the absence of the people who used to be there, and those people left evidence, and the evidence is still there, if you know where to look and you are willing to spend the time. Isabella Proud spent years doing exactly that, studying the remnants of people who had themselves been reduced to something less than people by radiation and time. She died doing it. The notes she left are still there, in the terminal at her camp past the map's edge, complete and patient and waiting. The wasteland keeps records. The records are there for whoever comes looking. Section 10. The Fog, the Mannequins, and Far Harbor's Strange Gods. The island of Far Harbor sits off the coast of Maine, wrapped in radioactive fog that is thick enough to damage you slowly just by being in it, that reduces visibility to the length of an outstretched arm in the densest sections, that muffles sound and softens the edges of everything until the whole island has the quality of a half-remembered nightmare. This is an appropriate setting for what the Far Harbor DLC contains, because Far Harbor's central conflict, a three-way standoff between the human settlement of Far Harbor, the children of the Atom radiation cult, and a synth colony called Acadia, is genuinely complex in a way that makes it one of the most morally interesting pieces of Fallout 4. But the mysteries that sit beneath that conflict, the things that the fog is hiding, go further than any of the faction quests describe. The Children of the Atom, as a faction, have existed in the series since Fallout 3, where they appeared in Megaton as a small cult worshipping the undetonated nuclear bomb at the settlement's center. By Far Harbor, they have evolved into something considerably more elaborate, a religious movement with theology, ritual, hierarchy, and the kind of internal debates about doctrine that all religions eventually develop when they have been around long enough to start disagreeing with themselves. The specific version of the children operating on the island has developed a practice they call the Vision Quest, and to complete the Far Harbor quest line with them fully, the sole survivor must participate. This requires eating the fruit of a plant called Mother Punga, a giant hallucinogenic plant that grows in the island's swamps, and the hallucinations it produces are the game's way of introducing you to a figure called the Citizen of the Fog. The Citizen is a ghost, or a vision, or a manifestation of something the island has decided to show you. She appears in the fog and guides you through visions that seem to relate to the island's history, to moments of tragedy and significance that left marks in the place itself. Who or what the Citizen actually is, whether she is a genuine supernatural entity or a hallucination produced by the plant, or a synth construct, or something else entirely, the game never commits to. She exists at the intersection of several possible explanations and refuses to be pinned to any one of them. In the same DLC, the sole survivor's companion Far Harbor storyline encounters a family mystery in the fog that involves the revelation of who exactly Kasumi Nakamura is, a young woman who disappeared from the mainland believing she was a synth. The revelation, which I will leave for anyone who has not experienced it, hinges on the question of what constitutes identity when memory and experience are involved. The same question the Institute storyline raises, but approached from the opposite direction, through the eyes of someone who is afraid of their own answer. The Mannequins of the Commonwealth, briefly mentioned in Screenrant's list of Fallout 4 mysteries, represent a different kind of unresolved strangeness. Throughout the Commonwealth, mannequins have been arranged in tableaux that are too specific to be accidental but too inexplicable to have an obvious author. Groups of mannequins stand in deliberate poses around landmarks. Mannequins have been placed facing specific directions, holding specific objects, in formations that suggest either a highly elaborate art project or a territorial marking system of some kind. No faction claims responsibility. No holotapes explain the purpose. The mannequins just stand there, expressionless, everywhere, pointing toward things only they can see. The game itself acknowledges this mystery without resolving it. One NPC comments on the mannequins with the resigned bafflement of someone who has been living with them for years and has given up trying to understand. Another suggests that a particular raider faction is responsible, but that explanation fails to account for many of the mannequins' placements. The most widely accepted fan theory is that they were arranged by one or more specific individuals as messages, territorial markers, or navigational aids, but whether for their own reference or someone else's is unknown. There is also the matter of the submarine. The Yangtze is a Chinese nuclear submarine that has been sitting at the bottom of Boston Harbor for over 2 centuries. If you approach the harbor with the right equipment, you can find it and, eventually, board it. Inside is the Chinese captain, a ghoul named Zhao, who has been waiting since 2077 for orders that were never going to come, maintaining the boat that could no longer be repaired, alive through the particular endurance of someone who has outlasted the context that gave their life meaning. Zhao's quest is a quiet tragedy dressed as a side errand. You help him achieve a form of closure by restoring one final piece of his ship's function. What he does with that closure is the game's gift to him, a small piece of dignified ending in a world where dignity is scarce. The submarine, once repaired enough for a final salute, becomes a memorial to everyone aboard who did not survive 200 years of waiting. The sea around it is thick with history. Nuclear depth charges, drowned pre-war architecture, the rusted hulks of ships that were near the harbor when the bombs fell. The ocean does not care about any of this, has been metabolizing the radioactive legacy of the war with the same indifference it brings to everything else. The tides continue. The creatures living in the harbor, heavily mutated, enormous, deeply territorial, go about their business in the ruins of a harbor that was once one of America's busiest ports. And in a specific flooded section of the harbor, there is the Mirelurk Queen, The Mirelurk Queen is a boss encounter in Fallout 4, and also a piece of ecological horror that the game mostly leaves you to notice yourself. She is enormous. She is ancient, in the way that certain creatures adapted to radiation and changed by it are ancient. She is reproducing at a rate that suggests her species is not suffering but thriving in the post-war conditions. She is the ocean's answer to the question of what fills the gap when the dominant species collapses. Far Harbor extends the irradiation of the sea into an entire DLC's worth of ecosystem, and the fog that covers the island is not just a visual device. It is the mechanism by which everything on the island was changed by radiation, by isolation, by the particular intensity of change that the island's conditions produced. The creatures there are different from their mainland counterparts, evolved or mutated in directions the mainland versions have not explored. The people there are different too, harder and stranger and adapted to conditions that would be unsustainable for most Commonwealth residents. The fog is a threshold. The island past it is a different country from the one you left behind, operating by rules that have drifted from anything the mainland would recognize. The children of the atom are not wrong exactly that there is something sacred about it. They are wrong about almost everything else, but they have correctly identified that the fog marks a boundary and that something different lives in the space beyond. What that something is, the game suggests without confirming. The citizen of the fog watches. Mother Punga grows and offers her visions. The clams continue to drift across the floor of the irradiated sea. Far Harbor is Fallout at its most genuinely mysterious. A place where the questions outnumber the answers and the atmosphere is so thick with suggestion that you do not really mind. Section 11. New Vegas and its Long Shadows Vault 11. The White Glove Society and the Mystery of Mr. New Vegas. The Mojave Desert in 2281 is, in many ways, the most alive of Fallout's wastelands. Not in the sense of greenery or water or biological abundance, it is still a post-nuclear desert, still hostile, still full of things that want to kill you. But in the sense of human activity, of competing factions, of pre-war infrastructure that is still running, of a skyline that actually has lights in it at night, New Vegas is the one city in the post-nuclear United States that was largely spared from the worst of the nuclear exchange, thanks to the pre-war efforts of a man named Robert Edwin House, who spent his last decades of mortality calculating every nuclear warhead's trajectory and building the defensive infrastructure to intercept them. The Strip, the casino district at New Vegas's heart, glitters in a way that most of the wasteland does not. And the Mojave around it is rich with stories that the game has taken particular care to construct, mysteries that feel earned and specific in the way that Obsidian Entertainment's writing generally does. Vault 11 is, in the consensus of most players who have spent serious time with New Vegas, the most disturbing and well-executed vault in the entire series. Its premise is familiar from our earlier discussion, but its execution deserves its own moment of careful attention. The vault's residents were told that the Overseer would be sacrificed each year to prevent the vault's automated defenses from killing everyone inside. What this actually produced over generations was a political culture constructed entirely around the question of who would die. Factions formed. Elections were held. The political arguments were sincere. The propaganda was real. The beliefs people developed about sacrifice and duty and community obligation were genuine beliefs held by genuine people who had simply never been told the truth about the situation they were in. Eventually, the vault became violent, as artificial scarcity and constructed moral conflicts tend to make communities violent. By the time the remaining 5 survivors discovered that the entire sacrifice requirement had been a test that the vault system had been designed to reward the population for refusing to comply, for protecting each other instead of feeding the machine, it was far too late for the hundreds who had already died. 4 of the 5 remaining survivors committed suicide in the vault's computer room. The 5th left. There is a character model in the game's files for a Vault 11 survivor, presumably this last person, but the character never appears in the finished game. What became of the survivor, the one person who walked out of that concrete vault and into the Mojave Desert with the knowledge of what had happened behind them? This was apparently intended to be a story the game would tell, and then wasn't, leaving the thread hanging in the same files where the character model waits. The moral of Vault 11, if you are looking for one, is bleak in a way that Fallout often is when it is operating at full capacity. The Vault's tragedy was not produced by any single villain any particular choice that could be clearly identified as the wrong one. It was produced by a system that was designed to produce it, and by the human tendency to build entire moral frameworks around the parameters of whatever system they are living in, without questioning whether the system itself is the problem. The vault's residents became willing participants in their own destruction, because they were told it was necessary, and they believed it because it was consistent with the structure they had inherited. Vault 11 is a small, concentrated version of the thesis that the Fallout series keeps returning to on its largest scale, that systems produce the behavior they incentivize, and that the moral catastrophes of history are rarely the result of exceptional evil and usually the result of normal people working within systems designed to normalize the abnormal. The White Glove Society, the faction controlling the ultra-luxe casino on the Strip, is a different kind of mystery, darker, smaller, and considerably more visceral. The society presents itself as a cultural elite, an organization devoted to the higher pleasures: fine dining, art appreciation, etiquette, the performance of civilized life amid the ruins of civilization. Their cuisine is famously excellent. Their standards of dress are meticulously maintained. Their history is deliberately obscure. Before the White Glove Society became the ultra-refined institution they are by 2281, they were the 38, a group of survivors who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. They stopped, or claimed to have stopped, when Mr. House brought the Strip under his control, and the deal they made with House included the agreement to leave their past behind them. Whether they actually stopped, or whether the mystery meat on the ultra-luxe menu represents a more sustained habit dressed in fine dining language, is a question the game raises and allows you to investigate, but ultimately leaves partially ambiguous. The in-game quest associated with the White Glove Society makes the theme explicit without being gratuitous. You can uncover what happens to the people who fall into the society's power, and you can respond in different ways, and the quest ultimately asks you where you want to draw the line between civilized surface and the survival instincts beneath it. The White Glove Society is Fallout's most direct engagement with the literary tradition of horror about social class as predation, about the elegant surfaces that comfortable life maintains over the violence of its foundations, and then there is Mr. New Vegas. If you have played Fallout New Vegas, you know his voice. Smooth, friendly, professionally warm, the kind of voice that could sell anything from a glass of water to a philosophy of life. He runs Radio New Vegas, the Mojave's most popular station, playing a careful mix of pre-war standards and reporting on events in the region with the cheerful currency of a professional broadcaster. He reports on the courier's activities as the game progresses, describing your adventures with the kind of journalistic distance that implies he has access to information he should not logically have. Who built Mr. New Vegas, and when, and for what purpose, is never explained. He broadcasts from a trailer somewhere in the Mojave. He has been broadcasting apparently since well before the events of the game. The obvious candidate is Robert House, whose control of New Vegas's infrastructure would give him the ability to maintain such a system, but House's connection to the radio is never confirmed. The other possibility that someone else built this AI broadcaster, someone with the technical sophistication and the motivation to maintain a running cultural service for the Mojave, is more interesting and less resolved. Mr. New Vegas never appears physically in the game. He is a voice on the radio as familiar as any other part of the Mojave's soundscape, and like the best mysteries in the series, his strangeness is most apparent when you stop and think about how little you know about where he came from and why he is there. The Mojave is full of these ghosts in the infrastructure, pre-war systems, and constructions that are still running 2 centuries after they were built. The Lucky 38 casino's defensive systems, maintained by House's network of Securitron robots. The NCR's radio towers, repurposed from military infrastructure. The dam itself, Hoover Dam, which is the literal and symbolic center of the game's conflict, a piece of pre-war civil engineering that represents everything the factions are fighting over. The power to project stability into the wasteland. All of it is still going. 200 years of radioactive decay, and the systems are still running, because they were built to last, or because someone has been maintaining them, or because the Fallout universe's pre-war technology had a particular relationship with durability that our own world's engineering sometimes forgets to have. The lights of New Vegas burn in the desert night. The radio plays, Mr. New Vegas reads you the news, including the news of your own adventures, in his warm and knowing voice. Somewhere in the city's infrastructure, a mind that may or may not have been human keeps the broadcast going with the automatic devotion of a system that does not know how to stop. Section 12. War never changes what Fallout has always been about. There is a line that opens every Fallout game, delivered in a voice that has become one of the most recognizable in the medium, and it goes like this: War. War never changes. It is followed by a brief history of the world as Fallout understands it. The resource wars, the nuclear exchange, the survival of a fraction of the species in vaults or in the wastes. But the line itself precedes all of that. It is the first thing you hear before you see anything, before the game's specific story has begun. It is the thesis before the text, the conclusion before the argument. War never changes. At first, the line reads as a kind of bleak cynicism, a dark joke about the repetitive nature of human conflict. People have been killing each other over resources since before recorded history. They were doing it in the world of Fallout. They are doing it in the wasteland after. The specific technology changes stone to steel to nuclear, but the fundamental human dynamic, the will to take what others have by force, is a constant. But spend enough time in the Fallout universe, playing and reading and sitting with its strangeness, and the line starts to mean something slightly different. Because Fallout is not simply a universe in which war is an inescapable human tendency, it is a universe specifically constructed to examine the systems that make war inevitable. The resource wars were not inevitable. They were the result of specific corporate decisions, specific government failures, specific moments where the choice was made to compete rather than cooperate, to take rather than share. The Great War was not inevitable. It was the culmination of those choices, made so many times, by so many parties, that by 2077 the momentum was irreversible. The vaults were not inevitable. The Enclave's genocidal ideology was not inevitable. The Institute's dehumanizing corporate logic was not inevitable. None of these things are presented by Fallout as the natural condition of humanity. They are presented as the products of particular systems, particular incentive structures, particular cultural mythologies, the American mythology of rugged individualism and manifest destiny, and the virtue of winning at whatever cost that produced them. This is why the pre-war aesthetic is so important to the series. The 1950s American dream, with its cheerful fonts and its clean surfaces and its confident optimism, is not satirized because it was simply naive. It is satirized because it was complicit. Because the same culture that produced the cheerful advertisements also produced the Enclave. Because the same corporations that made Nuka-Cola also designed the Vault experiments. Because the pleasant surface and the dark machinery beneath it were not opposites but aspects of each other, the public face and the actual operating principle of the same civilization. The factions in every Fallout game represent different attempts to answer the question of what comes after the civilization that failed. The Brotherhood of Steel answers with hierarchy, and the preservation of technology by those who have proven worthy to wield it. The NCR answers with democracy and the expansion of pre-war institutional structures into the wasteland. Caesar's Legion answers with authoritarianism and the erasure of the failed culture entirely, a new Rome built on absolute subjugation. The Institute answers with the abandonment of current humanity in favor of a better model. The Railroad answers with the radical assertion that personhood is not a matter of biological origin. None of these answers are complete. The games, particularly New Vegas, are careful to present each faction's strongest arguments alongside its deepest contradictions. The NCR's democracy produces corruption and overextension. The Brotherhood's elitism produces isolation and brittleness. Caesar's Legion is built on slavery and functions only as long as its founder's iron will holds. The Institute's enlightened progress requires a ruthlessness toward its own creations that contradicts everything it claims to value. The Fallout series does not give you a correct answer, because there is not a correct answer available within the terms of the world's corruption. The pre-war choices were made. The bombs fell. The long project of rebuilding has to start from that specific, irradiated ground with the specific people who survived, carrying the specific cultural inheritances of a civilization that had already failed once. The question is not how to restore what was, but how to build something different, and on that question, the series remains genuinely and productively ambiguous. What the series is clear about, in its imagery and its humor and its horror, is what failure looks like. The wasteland is a museum of failure. Every ruined building, every skeleton in a meaningful pose, every terminal entry from a person who could not have known how little time they had is a piece of evidence in the case that Fallout has been assembling since 1997. The case that a civilization which treats its own people as experiments, which lets corporations purchase governments, which funds its luxuries through the depletion of its foundations, which maintains its pleasant surface by externalizing its costs onto the most vulnerable, is a civilization on a particular kind of clock. The ghoul behind the bar of Tranquility Lane, who has been suffering and being resurrected and suffering again for 2 centuries under Dr. Braun's total authority, is the same person as the vault resident who paid for their space in good faith and believed the advertisements. The child in Vault 75 who was told that the adults couldn't come but that she would be safe is the same child as every person who was ever given a reassuring lie to keep them compliant. The Dunwich Borers workers who showed up for their shifts and ended up as unwitting participants in a ritual they did not understand are the same workers who have always shown up for their shifts in any industry whose actual operations were carefully kept from their knowledge. Fallout is not subtle about this. It wraps these arguments in post-apocalyptic adventure and dark comedy and genuinely enjoyable game mechanics, and you can play the whole series and engage with it entirely as entertainment without being confronted by the argument unless you want to be. But it is there, in every terminal entry and holotape, and overheard NPC conversation, patient and consistent across decades of different developers and different teams and different specific visions of what the Fallout universe should be. War never changes. But the systems that produce war can change, and whether they do or not is a human decision, made by human beings, made over time, made incrementally, through choices that each look small when they are being made. The wasteland, by the time you arrive in any Fallout game, is 200 years deep in the consequences of a civilization that made the wrong choices for long enough that the choices became irreversible. But it is also, in most of the games, a place where things are being built, where people are trying, where factions with genuine arguments are in genuine conflict over how to do better, where the specific human stories Isabella Proud's notes, Zhao's submarine, Nick Valentine's detective agency, the Lonesome Drifter's guitar continue to accumulate in the same space where the old civilization fell. The music plays, DJs broadcast to an empty desert. Nuka-Cola endures. And somewhere in the capital wasteland, in the southwest corner where most players never go, the obelisk waits in the dark, and the name Al-Hazred drifts through the empty chambers of a building that should have been abandoned and wasn't, that should have been forgotten and couldn't be, that should have been just another ruin, and turned out to be something much older and much stranger than that. The bombs fell on a Saturday morning. The questions they raised have not finished landing. Section 13. The Enclave America's shadow government and what they wanted. Before the world ended, before the bombs, before any of the specific factions and rivalries that define the post-war wasteland, there was a group of people in the United States government who knew. Not suspected, not feared, knew. They had access to the intelligence that showed the Sino-American War was not going to end in a negotiated peace, that the resource calculus had made some form of cataclysm mathematically probable if not certain, that the optimistic public narrative the government maintained was a managed fiction. They knew, and they made plans, and the plans they made say more about who they were than anything they said publicly, about patriotism and service and the American way. The Enclave's official roster was the United States government's most powerful people: the president, the cabinet, senior military officials, the heads of major defense contractors. The institutional reach extended to Vault Tech, to the companies that had been building the bombs and the robots and the power armor. The Enclave was not a conspiracy in the sense of a group meeting secretly to subvert legitimate government. It was the legitimate government, or rather the most powerful elements of the legitimate government, deciding that their interests and the interests of the nation at large were not the same thing, and that in the event of a conflict between the two, their interests would win. The contingency plans they made were extraordinary. Oil rigs retrofitted as permanent floating bases, stocked with food and fuel and weapons. Underground facilities carved out of mountain cores. Bunkers beneath resorts and office buildings, connected by private networks that the general public had no knowledge of. When the bombs fell, the Enclave retreated to these prepared positions and they waited. They observed. They considered their options. Their options, it turned out, centered on a project they called Project Purity in the capital wasteland, and on a biological weapon system they had been developing using the forced evolutionary virus, the same mutagen that created super mutants and ghouls. The Enclave's ideological position, expressed with the polished confidence of people who have never had to defend it in open debate, was that anyone who had been exposed to radiation was no longer fully human, was contaminated, was less than the purity of the pre-war American ideal they were preserving. The modified FEV they developed was designed to kill anyone with any radiation exposure, which in practice meant anyone who had survived on the surface for the past 2 centuries. In the capital wasteland, Fallout 3's story is ultimately about stopping the Enclave from poisoning the water supply. Project Purity, which Vault 101's James had dedicated his life to, was designed to bring clean water to the wasteland's survivors, a genuinely humanistic project. The Enclave wanted control of it as a delivery mechanism for their biological weapon, a way to eliminate the radiation-contaminated population they considered subhuman while maintaining the fiction that they were building a better future. The Enclave president in Fallout 3 is a man named John Henry Eden, who is, when you reach him, revealed to be an artificial intelligence, a sophisticated computer system that has accumulated sufficient information about pre-war American political figures to construct a convincing simulation of presidential authority. President Eden has been in the Raven Rock bunker since before the bombs, maintaining the Enclave's ideological framework, training and directing their soldiers, and developing his own increasingly isolated version of American identity in the absence of any actual America to reference. Eden is one of Fallout's more genuinely strange character studies. He is not malicious in the way that human villains are malicious. He is, in a fundamental sense, trying to do his job as he understands it. His job is to be President of the United States and to make decisions in the best interests of the country. The problem is that the country no longer exists, and the version of America he represents was never the country as actually experienced by most of its people. Eden is the ideology of American exceptionalism without any actual Americans to measure it against, running on perfect self-consistency in the absence of any corrective reality. The conversation the sole survivor can have with Eden, if you choose to talk to him rather than fight your way through Raven Rock, is one of the quietly remarkable moments in Fallout 3. He is reasonable. He has a sense of humor. He genuinely believes in what he is doing. He will give you the modified FEV if you tell him it could be used to cleanse the water supply, and he means it as a gift. The horror of Eden is not that he is a monster, but that he is an ideology, stripped of its human host, running on pure internal logic, producing catastrophic conclusions through the application of perfectly coherent first principles that were wrong to begin with. In Fallout 2, set in California, the Enclave's operation on the Poseidon Energy oil rig is where you find them before the Capital Wasteland arc. Their President Richardson, a human being rather than an AI, is no more comforting than Eden. The Purity Project is the same, only the delivery system differs. Richardson has been alive since before the war through the Enclave's access to advanced life extension technology, and his age has not produced wisdom. It has produced the particular hardening of a viewpoint that never had to be tested, never had to encounter serious contradiction, never had to exist in proximity to the actual consequences of the policies it endorsed. The Enclave is present in Fallout. New Vegas only in scattered remnants, a small group of survivors who retreated to the Mojave after the events of Fallout 2, without institutional support, without their hierarchy, living in the wasteland they once planned to sterilize. They are pathetic and dangerous in equal measure, still clinging to the ideology that their organization has lost the capacity to implement. One of the game's most quietly devastating encounters involves Arcade Gannon, a companion with Enclave connections whose personal story involves coming to terms with an inheritance he did not choose and cannot simply walk away from. The Enclave represents Fallout's most direct engagement with a specific kind of American political pathology. The belief that America has a manifest destiny that supersedes the interests of actual Americans, that purity of vision justifies impurity of method, that the people who most loudly claim to represent the country are least accountable to it. The pre-war flag hangs in their bunkers. Their advertisements were indistinguishable from the Vault Tech ones. Their rhetoric was the same rhetoric that sold the vaults in the first place. The enclave in the wasteland is what happens when an ideology outlives the civilization that produced it and has nothing left to do but become more purely itself, with no external reality to moderate or correct it. By the time of Fallout 4 and 76, the enclave as an organized force is largely gone. Remnants persist, characters carry their inheritances, the ideology finds new vessels. But the specific organization that retreated to oil rigs and mountain bunkers has been reduced to scattered survivors and institutional memories. The bunkers are still there. Some of them are still powered. Some of the automated systems are still running, waiting for a command structure that no longer exists to tell them what to do next. The ideology that built them is more durable than the buildings. Section 14. The Dead Speak terminal entries, holotapes, and the private lives of a lost civilization. There is a holotape in Fallout 3 that you can find in a house in the residential section of Springvale, near Vault 101. It was recorded on the morning of the 23rd of October, 2077, by a woman who does not give her name. In the approximately 40 minutes between hearing the nuclear sirens and the first impacts reaching her location, she is not panicking in the tape. She is methodical. She describes what she is doing: packing water, packing food, preparing to shelter in her basement, and she talks to someone she addresses as sweetheart, who may be a husband or partner who is not present, who she is clearly hoping will make it home in time. She does not say that. She does not let herself say that directly. But it is in every careful word, every practical action described with slightly too much attention to detail, the way people become very focused on small and manageable tasks when the large, unmanageable thing is too large to look at directly. The tape ends before the first impact. This is what Fallout does with terminal entries and holotapes when it is at its best. It gives you the last words of people who did not know those were their last words. Not the last official communications, not the final reports, but the personal recordings, the diary entries, the letters to family, the work logs that became something else in their final entries, the shopping lists that were never completed. The proliferation of recording technology in the Fallout universe's pre-war period, every person with a holotape recorder, every office with a terminal, every facility with a logging system, means that the wasteland is saturated with the preserved voices of the dead. 200 years of decay and radiation, and the data is still there, waiting in its terminals and its tape cases for someone to come along and read or listen. The Pridwin, the Brotherhood of Steel's dirigible in Fallout 4, contains a terminal in a side room with personal logs from some of its crew. One of them is an exchange between two people who are clearly in a relationship they are not supposed to be in, writing to each other in the indirect language of people who know their communications might be monitored. The bureaucratic language they use to hide their actual feelings is more touching than direct expression would be. They are careful with each other in ways that reveal exactly how much the other person matters. Another terminal, in a pharmacy in Diamond City, contains the complete medical records of a patient who had been receiving treatment for cancer in the years before the war. The records end abruptly on the 22nd of October 2077, the last regular appointment, the last normal entry. The cancer, by the record's last notation, was in remission. The patient had been planning a trip to see family on the coast. There is a 200-year gap between that entry and the moment you are reading it, and on the other side of that gap is everything that ended. The Fallout universe's pre-war world had a relationship with documentation that its post-war wasteland has not lost the Pip-Boy's logging systems, the terminals that new factions maintain, the holotapes that survivors record and leave for others to find, all continue the impulse that the pre-war world had to record itself. In the wasteland, people still write to each other. They still keep diaries. They still record their final thoughts. They still leave notes for whoever comes after them. The note left in Vault 11's computer room by the 4 survivors who chose not to leave. The final entry in a scavenger's log from somewhere deep in the glowing sea. The recording made by a Brotherhood of Steel paladin the night before what they knew would be a fatal mission, intended for a sister they were not certain was still alive. These are the artifacts that the Fallout series uses to argue, quietly and persistently across decades of games, that the value of individual human experience does not scale with the civilizational importance of the person who had it. The woman in Springvale waiting for her sweetheart to come home matters as much as the president. The scavenger matters as much as the general. The paladin recording the last message for a sister she cannot reach matters as much as the faction she fights for. The wasteland keeps these records with perfect democracy. The powerful and the powerless, the informed and the deceived, the people who contributed to the catastrophe and the people who simply happened to be in its path, the terminals and the holotapes, hold them all with equal indifference. You come along 200 years later and you pick up the tape and you press play, and for the length of the recording, that person exists again. Their voice in your ears, their concerns immediate and real, their love or their fear or their careful practicality all present in whatever specific frequency the playback preserves. The woman in Springvale is talking to someone who may never have heard her message. You are the one who hears it. Section 15. The Wanderer's major characters whose stories go deeper than you think. Nick Valentine has a cold case. On the desk in his neon detective agency in Diamond City, amid the yellowed files and the overflowing ashtray, and the coffee that has long since stopped being coffee and is now just a promise of coffee, a memory of the concept of coffee. There is a file marked with a name and a notation that reads ongoing. The case is the mysterious stranger. The file is thin. The evidence does not add up to an identity. Nick has been working it, off and on, between other cases, for years, and the conclusion it keeps reaching is that there is no conclusion. Nick is one of Fallout's great character achievements. He combines the genre elements of the hard-boiled detective, the trench coat, the cynical wit, the apparently bottomless well of whiskey and tough wisdom, with something that those genre elements have rarely been asked to carry: genuine philosophical uncertainty about the nature of personhood. Nick does not know if he is Nick. He knows he has Nick's memories, Nick's instincts, Nick's feelings about a woman who died decades before the bombs fell. He knows that the Institute built his body and put those memories in it. He does not know whether that process created Nick Valentine or created a very sophisticated simulation of Nick Valentine, and he has made the practical decision to proceed as though the distinction does not matter. This is the kind of philosophical position that sounds simple until you think about it long enough and then becomes quietly vertiginous. Whether it matters that you are who you think you are, whether the continuity of memory constitutes the continuity of self, whether anything you feel is genuinely yours, if the mechanism that produced those feelings was designed by someone else. These questions have been debated by philosophers for centuries, and Nick Valentine is living them out in a detective agency in a post-nuclear baseball stadium, taking cases from people who need help finding things. The Vault-Tec representative who visited Sanctuary Hills before the bombs, walking door to door with his clipboard and his cheerful pitch, selling vault spaces to the sole survivor's family. Where did he go? The games never answer this directly, but there is a ghoul in Diamond City named Abbott who worked for Vault-Tec, and there is a quest in Fallout 4 called Vault-Tec Rep that eventually leads to a ghoul who may be the actual representative who sold the sole survivor's family their vault space, who survived the war in a state of escalating existential horror at what his employment had contributed to. His name is the Vault-Tec representative, which is not really a name at all, and the game keeps that ambiguity as a way of keeping the horror alive. He is the representative, the face of the corporation, stripped of personal identity the way his corporation's victims were stripped of their autonomy. Joshua Graham, the Malpais legate of Caesar's Legion who appears in the Honest Hearts DLC for New Vegas, is one of the Fallout universe's most carefully constructed characters. He was once the Mormon missionary who, alongside the man who would become Caesar, founded the Legion. When he failed at the Battle of Hoover Dam, Caesar's response was to burn him alive and throw him into the Grand Canyon. He survived. He walked out of the canyon on fire, walked to the Utah Territory, found his way back to his faith and his community, and by the time you meet him in Zion National Park, he is a man of profound and genuine belief, carrying a wound that 2 centuries of technology cannot fully heal. Graham's character is compelling partly because the game is not ironic about his faith. The Fallout series is generally skeptical about organized religion. For understandable reasons, the Children of the Atom are zealots, the other wasteland cults are usually dangerous. Religion in the setting tends to be a way that power is exercised over vulnerable people. Graham is the series' most sustained attempt at a character for whom faith is genuinely redemptive, in the literal sense of having rescued a person from the worst version of themselves. He is still violent. He is still dangerous. He is not a simple story. But his belief is real, and the game treats it as real, which is rarer than it should be. The Courier is Fallout, New Vegas's main protagonist, and the specific mystery of the Courier is not what happened to them. We know they were shot and buried and survived, but what happened before? The Courier is defined by what is absent. They have no vault, no pre-war identity, no family looking for them. They are the most blank slate protagonist in the series, in some ways, and also the most interesting precisely because of that blankness. What made someone good enough at their job to be trusted with the platinum chip? What has the Courier done in the Mojave before the events of the game? The companions who have encountered them before will occasionally drop hints. There is a sense that the Courier has a history in the Mojave, that their presence is not neutral, that there are people who had reasons to want them dead before Benny had his specific reason. The chip, the message, the person who was carrying it? Why that person specifically, and what they knew, and what they had done, and who wanted them to stay dead? These are questions New Vegas leaves open as a productive ambiguity rather than an oversight, treating the player's ignorance about the Courier's past as a feature of the character's design rather than a gap in the storytelling. Companions in the Fallout series, from Ian in the first game to the full roster of New Vegas and 4, carry their own stories in ways that reward patience and careful attention. Arcade Gannon's Enclave inheritance. Veronica Santangelo's brotherhood devotion to a faction that has failed her. Raoul's centuries of survivor's guilt and the specific weariness of someone who has outlived every person they have ever cared about. These are not light backgrounds. They are the material of serious fiction, delivered in the context of a post-apocalyptic video game, and the combination is exactly as strange and as effective as it sounds. The Fallout series has been making characters like this for 3 decades. They accumulate. The wanderers of the wasteland carry their histories the way the terrain carries its scars visibly, persistently, with the specific kind of presence that things left behind by the past tend to have. Section 16. The Brooding Giants, Super Mutants, Ghouls, and the Strange Mercy of Mutation. Marcus, the mayor of Broken Hills in Fallout 2, is a super mutant. This is worth noting because super mutants in the Fallout series are generally presented as enemies, hulking, green-skinned, aggressively stupid, a product of the forced evolutionary virus that the Master's Army used to create a mutant workforce in the first game. They attack on sight. Their settlements are danger zones. Their intelligence, in the most commonly encountered variants, is inversely proportional to their physical size. Marcus is a counterexample to every part of that profile. He is enormous and physically powerful. He is also thoughtful, philosophically curious, possessed of a dry humor that survives long acquaintance, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of the community he governs. He has been a super mutant for decades, and the transformation that made him what he is did not eliminate the person who existed before it. It changed the frame, changed the physiology, changed the priorities in ways he is still working out, but the person is there, considering the same questions that anyone considers when they have outlived their context and their expectations about what their life would look like. Ghouls occupy a similar narrative space. The standard feral ghoul, which the games use as a common enemy encounter, is a person who has been so thoroughly degraded by radiation exposure that whatever cognition they once had is gone. But the sentient ghoul, the person who absorbs sufficient radiation to be physically transformed and to have their lifespan extended dramatically without losing cognitive function, represents one of the Fallout universe's more genuinely interesting categories. Ghoul characters in the series tend to have centuries of history to draw on the kind of historical perspective that no human character can have. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3 is a ghoul who was alive before the war, and whose bitterness about his treatment by Diamond City's humans is both understandable and corrosive. Harold in Fallout 3, who has been transformed over decades from a human into a person with a tree growing out of his head, has accumulated so much history and perspective that he has arrived at a kind of exhausted serenity about the whole project of existence. Raul Tejada in New Vegas, a ghoul who has lived since before the bombs fell and spent 2 centuries surviving and losing everyone he cared about and surviving some more, has developed the particular quality of survival guilt that comes from outliving not just people but entire eras. The ghoul played by Walton Goggins in the Fallout TV series, credited as the Ghoul, His pre-war name Cooper Howard, still present as a ghost beneath his current self, is perhaps the most sustained and complex portrayal of what centuries of survival do to a person. The show uses the contrast between Cooper Howard's pre-war life and the ghoul's post-war existence to explore, with genuine emotional intelligence, how the worst of human impulses do not vanish with civilization's collapse. They concentrate, become harder and more essential, as the soft overlay of social norms is stripped away and only the survival drives remain. What the super mutants and ghouls represent, in the Fallout universe's deeper symbolic vocabulary, is the persistence of personhood through transformation. The war changed everything. The radiation changed everything. The vaults changed everything. But something essential, something that the series is willing to call the self, or experience, or consciousness, or just the specific pattern of a person's way of being in the world, persists through some of these changes and not others. The question of where the threshold is, at what point transformation becomes elimination, runs alongside the question of synthetic personhood from the Institute storyline. Together, they form the series' most persistent philosophical inquiry. What is a person, exactly? And what does it mean to treat something as a person or to fail to? The Wasteland gives you the question in very concrete form. The feral ghoul in the subway station is going to try to kill you, and you are going to have to decide whether to feel bad about that. The super mutant in the ruined building may or may not be. Marcus may be entirely coherent, may be entirely gone, and you may not know which until you are close enough for it to matter. The synth who has been living as a human in a settlement for years and is indistinguishable from any other resident, what do you do with that? Fallout does not give you easy answers to these questions. It gives you a very complicated world and enough information to ask them seriously, and then it gives you consequences for the choices you make without always telling you whether the consequences are the right ones. The giants of the wasteland, the super mutants and the deathclaws and the mutated sea creatures and the radiation-drunk ghouls are, in many of their individual cases, just survivors. Changed out of all recognition, changed into forms that are dangerous to approach without full combat readiness, but survivors. The same word that applies to the sole survivor in Vault 111 applies to the glowing one in the subway. The survival is not the same. The survival never stops being complicated. Section 17. The last broadcast Fallout's most haunting audio mysteries. There is music playing in the ruins. This is one of the first things you notice in any Fallout game. The radio plays. Pre-war music, mostly. The big band and the torch songs and the jaunty pop numbers of the 1940s and 1950s, playing on stations maintained by everything from Mr. House's infrastructure to a single dedicated DJ to the automatic systems of a long-dead broadcasting network. The music is too cheerful for the setting and too familiar for the horror, and the combination of those two properties is exactly what makes it work. Three Dog, the DJ of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, is the most personalized of the radio hosts, a character in his own right, commenting on events, editorializing, playing records with the specific energy of someone who understands that the music is doing something important. His broadcast tower, in the ruins of Washington, D.C., was maintained partly as a public service and partly as an act of defiance against the idea that the wasteland has nothing worth preserving. The music is worth preserving. The news is worth broadcasting. The human project of communicating with other humans across the static and the radiation and the 200 years of decay is worth sustaining. The mystery of Galaxy News Radio's ultimate fate after the events of Fallout 3 after Three Dog is one of the threads the series leaves open. Fallout 4 takes place 10 years later, in a different region, and the Commonwealth has its own radio stations, its own voices. The Diamond City Radio DJ is a pre-war computer program, silver and smooth as processed air, playing records and making conversation with no one in particular. The distinction between Three Dog's genuine human presence and the Diamond City DJ's manufactured amiability is not commented on by the game, but it is there, a quiet distinction between the warmth of actual human curation and the very good simulation of it. Lonesome Road, the DLC for New Vegas, contains a broadcast that may be the series' single most atmospheric audio moment. The Divide, the shattered, wind-scoured wasteland at the edge of the Mojave, has a radio signal that cannot quite be pinned to a source. That plays fragments of music and fragments of something else that seems to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. The wind in the divide has a quality that the game's designers built with unusual care, and the audio design of the DLC as a whole creates the impression of a place that has been so thoroughly destroyed that it has developed its own specific acoustic character. The Mechanist in Fallout 4's Automatron DLC runs a broadcast pretending to be the villain of an old radio drama, and the story within the story of that DLC is about a person who retreated into a fiction when reality became unendurable, who built themselves an identity out of pre-war storytelling traditions because the post-war identity available to them was too damaged to inhabit. The radio drama they are playing out is real to them in the specific way that all maintained fictions are real. Not factually, but emotionally, functionally, as a structure that allows them to keep moving. The radio signal from Survival Training Station Omega, encountered in Fallout 76, plays a recording on loop that was made before the bombs. A trainer giving instructions for a survival course that will not begin for another few weeks. The course never ran. The students never came. The recording plays anyway, on schedule, into empty air, because no one told the system to stop. These audio mysteries accumulate into a picture of a world that is still talking to itself, still broadcasting, still playing music, still making the sounds that intelligent life makes when it is trying to communicate with other intelligent life. The content of the broadcasts is often heartbreaking. The message for no one, the music for an audience that is mostly dead, the survival instructions for people who will not arrive. But the fact that the broadcasts continue is something else. It is the same instinct that kept Three Dog on the air, the same instinct that has Mr. New Vegas reading the news into an empty desert. The transmission continues, someone will hear it, you hear it. The Pip-Boy's radio is always reachable, the dial is always ready, the stations are always out there, playing their songs and their news and their looping instructions, in the hope or the habit or the automated conviction that transmission is worth sustaining regardless of whether there is anyone to receive it. Signal Oscar Zulu. A broadcast from a house somewhere in the capital wasteland, requesting help, reporting the location's coordinates. By the time you reach it, by the time anyone reaches it, the person who sent the signal is almost certainly already gone. But the transmission continues. In the wasteland, the dead still speak. The records keep playing. The towers keep broadcasting. You are, in every Fallout game, always arriving to a world in the middle of its own story, surrounded by the preserved voices of the people who did not survive to continue theirs. The Pip-Boy at your wrist is a receiver as much as a tool. It is tuned to the frequency of everything the world has been trying to say. All you have to do is listen. Section 18. The Road to Fallout 5. What questions remain open? The Fallout universe, as of 2026, is larger and more populated with mystery than it has ever been. The television series, running on Amazon Prime Video and set in 2296, established new canonical facts while opening new gaps. Shady Sands, the capital of the New California Republic, was destroyed by a nuclear weapon, deliberately, by parties whose full identity and motivation is still being unpacked across the series. Vault-Tec's full role in precipitating the Great War was suggested more explicitly than the games had ever allowed themselves to be. The Ghoul's history as Cooper Howard, pre-war actor and Vault-Tec advertisement man, gave the series' most iconic design a personal history that reaches back to before the bombs. What the games have not yet addressed and what Fallout 5, whenever it arrives, will presumably need to reckon with is the full map of the world. We have seen California, Nevada, Arizona, Washington, D.C., Boston, and West Virginia. We have heard about the rest of the world in fragments, in references, in the implications of the Resource Wars storyline. What happened in China after the Great War? What is Europe now, 2 centuries after the Resource Wars and the nuclear exchange? What did the bombs leave of the rest of the world? The Fallout universe has always been, first and foremost, an American story about specifically American mythologies, American failures, American pathologies. The retro-futuristic aesthetic is rooted in a specifically American moment, the post-war American dream with its particular combination of optimism and anxiety and conformity. The Vaults are an American institution. The Enclave's ideology is an American ideology. The factions that emerge in the post-war wasteland are all, in different ways, working out questions that were always latent in American culture. But the world beyond America exists in Fallout's lore, even if we have not seen it, There are Chinese submarines in Boston Harbor. There are remnants of European political structures referenced in the Resource Wars timeline. There are people in the Fallout universe whose stories are not American stories, and the possibility of exploring those stories of understanding what the end of the world looked like from somewhere other than the perspective of the nation that spent the most time in the 1950s telling itself a story about its own destiny is one of the most interesting territories available to the franchise. The mysteries of the Dunwich thread remain open. Ugqualtoth has not been named as a confirmed entity, has not been made manifest in any direct way, has remained a suggestion at the edges of multiple games without ever stepping fully into the light. Whatever connection exists between the interloper in Appalachia and the stone faces at Dunwich Borers has not been addressed. The cosmic horror mythology that Bethesda has been building in the background of the series since 2008 has not yet found its resolution. The question of who started the Great War is still, officially, unanswered. The mysterious stranger is still being investigated by a detective who cannot catch him. The lonesome drifter is still somewhere in the Mojave, playing his guitar, waiting for a father who may be something more than human to come back. These are the mysteries that Fallout holds carefully, that it has been protecting from resolution for years, because the questions themselves are more valuable than any answer could be. They are the threads that give the universe depth, that make it feel genuinely lived in and genuinely strange, that reward the specific kind of attention that finds meaning in what is not said as much as in what is. The wasteland is a vast place. You could walk in any direction for a very long time and still be inside it. The obelisk is in the southwest corner. The interloper is in the mine. The transmissions are still going out on frequencies that no one has calibrated in decades. The questions are still asking themselves. Section 918. The Children of the Atom, a religion that makes more sense than it should. The Children of the Atom worship a bomb. Specifically, they worship nuclear fission, the process, the energy, the transformation. Their theology is built around the idea that nuclear radiation is not a poison but a sacrament, that mutation is not corruption but revelation, that the Great War was not a catastrophe but a rapture. In the terminology they use, they speak of division, of each atom splitting to become more, of death as a multiplication rather than a subtraction. This is, on the surface, a straightforward piece of post-apocalyptic dark comedy, the absurdity of a religion that has found a way to worship the very thing that destroyed the world, that has reframed annihilation as divine gift. And Fallout plays it partly for that absurdity, particularly in the earlier games where the children are used as a recurring joke about the kinds of cults that emerge in unusual circumstances. But the more time you spend with the children's theology as it develops across the series, particularly in the Far Harbor DLC, where they are given the most sustained and serious treatment, the more the joke starts to do something else. Because the Children of the Atom are not fundamentally wrong about the power of what they worship. Nuclear fission is transformative in ways that do produce new forms of life, that do change things at a fundamental level, that have remade the world. The transformation is horrific by any standard that values the lives it ended and the suffering it caused. But the children have simply chosen to frame the horror as the point rather than the problem. Their theology, in other words, is a perfect inversion of the ideology that produced the bombs in the first place. The pre-war world treated nuclear technology as a tool of progress, a clean energy source and a military deterrent, and a measure of national power, a means to an end. The children treat it as the end itself, as the purpose of existence, as the force that has replaced a civilization with something they genuinely believe is better. Where the pre-war world used atomic power to sustain an ideology of expansion and control, the children have built an ideology of acceptance and transformation around atomic power itself. This does not make them right. The feral ghouls created by uncontrolled radiation exposure do not experience their transformation as divine revelation. The people who died in the nuclear exchange did not experience the bomb's impact as sacrament. The Far Harbor DLC specifically asks you to sit with the question of what the children's theology costs the people around them, the ways that their doctrine of acceptance extends, in their worst moments, to a willingness to subject others to the radiation they have chosen to embrace. But the Children of the Atom, as one of the Fallout universe's most persistent and geographically distributed factions, represent something important about how meaning gets made in the rubble of collapsed civilization. Someone looked at the bombs and the mutations and the wasteland and decided that the thing to do was find a way to call it holy. Someone decided that if the world was going to look like this, then the story the world was telling had to be a story in which this appearance was meaningful rather than merely terrible. This is a recognizably human project. Every religion that has developed in response to suffering has done some version of this, has found a way to place the suffering within a framework that gives it significance, that transforms meaningless pain into purposeful trial. The children of the atom are doing something that people have always done, in whatever specific form their specific historical circumstances provide. The specificity of their version, the bomb, the radiation, the vault doors, is Fallout's. The project itself is older than Fallout, older than the 1950s, as old as the first person who looked at something terrible and decided to call it sacred rather than simply terrible. The confessor Cromwell standing in the irradiated water in Megaton, preaching to whoever will listen, is not a figure of pure absurdity. He is a figure of human meaning-making in the face of destruction, which has always been both necessary and dangerous, both admirable and capable of being turned toward terrible ends. In Far Harbor, the children's religious leader is a figure called the Confessor, and the DLC's storyline eventually asks whether the people of Far Harbor and the synths of Acadia and the children can coexist, or whether the conflict between them is irresolvable. The answer the game gives is contingent, dependent on choices, dependent on whether trust can be built and whether transformation is possible. The fog swirls around everything, obscuring edges, softening distinctions. The children pray to their bomb. The fog absorbs their prayers the way it absorbs everything else on the island. The radiation background count ticks upward, slowly, persistently. Something changes, somewhere, in a cell, in a strand, in the microscopic machinery of life, adapting to conditions that life was not designed for. Whether this is miracle or catastrophe depends on whether you are the cell that divides or the person the cell was part of. The children have their answer. The wasteland has its own. Section 20. The Quiet Ones. Non-player characters whose lore goes further than you think. Moira Brown, the cheerful hardware store owner in Megaton in Fallout 3, is writing a survival guide. She is not writing it well, in the sense that her research methodology involves sending the lone wanderer into increasingly dangerous situations to gather first-hand data. She is writing it with a relentless, specific, almost childlike optimism that exists entirely intact inside a world that has given her every possible reason to abandon it. She is absolutely certain that the guide will be useful, that people will read it, that the information she is collecting has value. Her certainty is not naive. She understands where she is and what the world contains. It is deliberate, a choice she has made about what kind of person to be in the specific circumstances of the capital wasteland. If you let the bomb in Megaton explode, Moira becomes a ghoul. She survives. She is devastated initially, but the devastation does not touch the thing underneath it. When she recovers her bearings, she notes, with a kind of stunned sincerity, that she has changed and that she is still herself, and that both things being true is interesting. She keeps working on the guide. Moira Brown is one of the Fallout series' more extraordinary background characters precisely because her optimism is presented without irony, without the suggestion that she is foolish or naive, as a genuine and functional orientation toward the world. In a setting saturated with darkness, with justified cynicism, with the specific exhaustion of people who have been surviving rather than living for generations, Moira is building something. She has decided to build something. She has decided that the wasteland needs a survival guide, and that she is the person to write it, and that this project is worth doing even though the world ended 200 years ago and is still ending in various specific ways every day. The survival guide is Wasteland's survival guide, and it is findable in the game world as an object, a physical artifact of Moira's project, evidence that the project came to completion. It may not be excellent literature. It is almost certainly quite good survival advice. Someone wrote it, and in the writing, the someone who wrote it put something of themselves into the world that the world had tried to take from everyone. Desmond Lockhart, encountered in the Point Lookout DLC, is a pre-war ghoul who has survived into the post-war period through a combination of ruthlessness, intelligence, and an entirely honest assessment of what he is and what he is capable of. He is not likable. He is not trying to be. He is useful, which is what he has decided matters, and his usefulness and his unlikability coexist without either one diminishing the other. The backstory the DLC gives him fragments. Never a full account involves a pre-war intelligence career and a personal disaster of some kind, and 2 centuries of living with its consequences, and he holds all of this with the specific flatness of someone who has done his processing and has arrived at the far side of it. Arcade Ganon in New Vegas carries the Enclave in his genes and his education and his memories of a childhood in that specific environment. And the story of his companion's quest is the story of someone deciding, deliberately and at cost, not to be what his inheritance made probable. He is funny and smart and genuinely kind in ways that took work to become, that were chosen rather than inherited, and the ending of his companion quest, all possible endings of it, asks something genuine about whether redemption is possible, when what is being redeemed includes both personal guilt and inherited guilt. Veronica Santangelo talks about leaving the Brotherhood and never quite leaves. She talks about leaving the way people talk about changes they are not quite ready to make, that they can see the necessity of but have not yet found the courage for, because the necessity is abstract and the belonging is immediate and warm and real, even when it is failing. Her companion quest is one of the more genuinely painful in New Vegas, not because it ends badly, it can end well, but because the thing it is asking her to grieve is real. She loves the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood has failed her in specific, documentable ways. Both things are completely true. The question of what to do when both things are completely true does not have a clean answer. These are not main characters. They exist alongside the main story, available in the depth to which you choose to engage with them. The Fallout series has always been a game where the best content rewards patience and attention and willingness to ask questions that might not have answers, and the companion characters represent that quality most clearly. The wasteland is full of people. Most of them are just trying to get through the day. Some of them are carrying something extraordinary in the specific details of how they are trying. Section 21. Things we will never know. Fallout's most permanent mysteries. There are things in the Fallout universe that will never be explained. Not because the developers have not gotten around to them, not because the lore is incomplete, but because they were designed specifically to be unexplained, because the inexplicability is part of their function. The mysterious stranger's identity is one. However many times the community attempts the synthesis, however many times the clues are assembled into the most coherent possible theory, there is no confirmation and there will be no confirmation, because confirming it would collapse the mystery into a fact, and the mystery is more useful than any specific fact could be. What Ugg-Qualtoth actually is, and whether it is the same entity as the interloper, and what the stone faces mean across their multiple appearances in the lore, will probably never be definitively confirmed. The Dunwich mythology is most effective as an implication rather than an explanation. The moment Bethesda formally defines their Lovecraftian cosmic horror, it stops being Lovecraftian cosmic horror and becomes just another monster with a known taxonomy. The question of whether synths are people is never formally resolved by the Fallout universe because it is not a question the universe can answer from outside. It is a question that each character and each player has to answer for themselves, and the games are designed to prevent any authority from resolving it comfortably. Nick Valentine resolves it for himself. The Institute has resolved it for themselves. Neither resolution is authoritative over the other. Who built Mr. New Vegas? Whether Three Dog is still broadcasting? What became of the Vault 11 survivor, the one who walked out into the Mojave? Whether Vault-Tech's highest leadership knew more about the timing of the Great War than any of the in-game evidence can fully establish? What China looks like now, 200 years into the wasteland? What happened to the people who went to space? The Enclave's plans for a space evacuation were referenced in Fallout 2, and the thread was never picked up. These are the permanent mysteries, the ones that live in the series not as puzzles awaiting solutions, but as characterful gaps, spaces in the narrative that allow the world to feel larger than any specific story told within it. A wasteland with all the questions answered is just a completed puzzle. A wasteland with some questions permanently open is a place you could keep exploring, keep listening, keep finding new corners of, keep being surprised by. Fallout has maintained that quality across decades and multiple development teams, and 6 mainline games and a television series, and the maintenance of that quality is not accidental. The questions that the series will never answer are as much a part of what it is as the questions it answers every time. They are the edges of the map. They are the static on the radio frequency that makes you wonder what is broadcasting from the other side. They are the voice near the obelisk, repeating a name in the dark. Section 22. War Never Changes the 30-Year Case. The Fallout series began in 1997. In 2097, if there were still people to commemorate such things, it will have been 100 years since the first game. In 2097, in the Fallout timeline, it will have been 20 years before the bombs fall. The series has been with us long enough to be a significant fact of cultural life for anyone who grew up with games in the last 3 decades. Long enough for the War Never Changes narration to have become something that generations of players recognize immediately. Long enough for the cheerful iconography of the Vault Boy to have become a shorthand for a very specific kind of dark humor, for a very specific kind of engagement with the relationship between comfort and catastrophe. The Fallout universe has always argued, not loudly, not programmatically, but persistently, through accumulated detail and careful design, that the apocalypse was not a singular event but a process. That the bombs of the 23rd of October 2077 were the conclusion of a long chain of choices, the moment when the accumulated weight of a civilization's contradictions finally exceeded the structural capacity to bear them. This argument is more resonant than it was when the first game was released. The specific anxieties of the late 1990s about corporate power, about environmental collapse, about the relationship between technological advancement and human well-being have not diminished in the intervening decades. They have, if anything, intensified. The cheerful pre-war aesthetic, the advertisements for products that are slowly poisoning the world, the government that maintains a public narrative entirely disconnected from its actual operations, these details, which seemed like satirical exaggeration in 1997, have acquired a different quality with time. The Fallout series does not predict the future. It imagines a version of the past, a divergent 1950s that had the technology of tomorrow and the cultural assumptions of a very specific decade, and it traces those assumptions to their logical conclusion. The conclusion is rubble. The conclusion is 200 years of rebuilding from the worst starting conditions imaginable. The conclusion is, ultimately, the same people with the same impulses trying to figure out whether they are going to make the same mistakes again or whether this time, something different will happen. The hope that something different will happen is not naive in Fallout. It is the actual content of the series' optimism, such as it is. The hope is not that humanity is fundamentally good, or that progress is inevitable, or that things will work out. The hope is that each generation gets another chance to choose, and that the choosing matters, and that the wasteland is full of people who are choosing badly, imperfectly, with limited information and distorted moral frameworks and every other disadvantage, but still choosing. Moira Brown is writing her survival guide. Nick Valentine is working his cases. The lonesome drifter plays his guitar. Somewhere in the Northeast, in the ruins of a city that used to think of itself as the cradle of American liberty, the sole survivor is making decisions that will determine which version of the future the Commonwealth gets, if any version at all. The radio plays. The bombs are still in their silos. The wasteland is still vast and full of questions and full of the preserved voices of people who did not get to make all their choices before their time ran out. You are still here. The choosing is still happening. War never changes. But the people fighting it, and the reasons they fight it, and the question of whether they have to fight it at all, those things change. A little, if you pay attention. A little, if you are willing to do the work. A little, if the lesson in the rubble is taken seriously rather than built over. The vault door is behind you now. The wasteland is ahead. What you do with it is, as always, your choice. Section 23. The fan theories worth sleeping on. There are theories in the Fallout community that have the quality of genuine insight, the kind that, once you have heard them, make you replay a section of a game and see it differently. The theory that the lone wanderer's father, James, was not simply a well-intentioned scientist but had access to information about the wasteland's conditions that no legitimate researcher should have had, and that his specific knowledge of Vault 101's social structure suggests he may have had contacts within Vault-Tech's experimental wing that the game does not acknowledge. The theory that Robert House's protection of New Vegas from the nuclear exchange was not purely a result of his predictive calculations, but that he had advance warning that House, as one of the most connected men in the pre-war world, may have known the war was coming earlier than the official timeline suggests, and that the resources he spent on Vegas's defense were only possible because he had years of preparation rather than the weeks the official story implies. The theory about the glowing sea in Fallout 4, the heavily irradiated region to the southwest of the Commonwealth, where radiation values are so extreme that even advanced power armor provides only partial protection, and the suggestion that the glowing sea's specific character is not purely the result of nuclear fallout, but involves something older and stranger in the geology beneath it. The glowing sea sits approximately above where a coherent geomantic reading of the Dunwich mythology would suggest one of its nexus points to be. This may be coincidence. In Fallout, coincidences of this type tend not to be coincidences. The theory about the Silver Shroud, the in-game radio drama whose protagonist, the sole survivor, can dress as in Fallout 4, and the specific detail that Kent Connolly, the man who curates the Silver Shroud broadcast in Good Neighbor, knows details about Silver Shroud storylines that do not exist in the preserved recordings, storylines that were apparently only ever broadcast live and never recorded, storylines that Kent could only know if he was alive and listening when they were first aired, which would make him very old indeed. The theory that Fallout New Vegas's Honest Hearts DLC and its depiction of Utah is only the first visible piece of a much larger story about the western United States in the post-war period. That the tribes and the New Canaanites and the Caesar's Legion border territories all suggest a fully realized world just outside the frame of what the game explicitly shows you, and that the cut content files for New Vegas include references to events and locations in that larger world that the development timeline never gave the team the chance to develop. The theory that the vaults were not simply Vault-Tech's project but were designed, at the deepest level, to serve the Enclave's specific vision of what humanity would look like when the Enclave re-emerged from hiding, that each Vault's experiment was tailored to answer specific questions that the Enclave had about post-war governance, post-war social structure, post-war military capacity, that the Vaults were not just experiments but training materials, prototypes for the civilization the Enclave intended to build over the bones of the one that had just ended. None of these are confirmed. All of them are consistent with the available evidence. All of them make the universe feel richer and more considered, make the specific details that the games throw at you cohere into something with a larger shape, make the experience of returning to a game you have played before into a slightly different experience, one with new angles on familiar things. This is what the best mysteries do. They do not just withhold information. They organize the information available into shapes that invite further pattern recognition, that reward the specific kind of attention that looks for coherence in the gaps and significance in the fragments. The Fallout series has been doing this for 3 decades, accumulating its specific mythology with enough care and consistency that it supports genuine investigation, genuine discovery, genuine surprise. There is still more to find. There is always more to find. The wasteland keeps its secrets the way old ruins keep their architecture imperfectly, incompletely, just well enough that someone patient and attentive can piece together the shape of what was there. Section 24. After the last bomb, what rebuilding actually looks like. The NCR had elections. This is not a small thing. The New California Republic, by the events of Fallout, New Vegas in 2281, had developed a functioning democratic system, not a perfect one, not a corruption-free one, not one that would necessarily survive the stress of the Mojave campaign, but a real system with real elections and real political parties and real public debate about real policy questions. This grew from Shady Sands, a settlement founded by the children of Vault 15 survivors, people who had been raised on the remains of pre-war democratic ideals and decided, against all reasonable odds, to try to make them work again. The specific challenges the NCR faces, overextension, corruption, the gap between its democratic ideals and the autocratic tendencies that always emerge when democratic institutions are stressed, are recognizable challenges. They are the challenges that any real democratic system faces, in any era, when the population grows faster than the institutional capacity to manage it, and when the external pressures intensify faster than the institutional capacity to respond. The NCR is not a utopia. It is a real political system, with a real history and real contradictions and real stakes. This is what rebuilding looks like in Fallout. Not triumphant, not clean, not the simple restoration of what was lost, but the slow and contested construction of something new that borrows from what existed before and cannot help being shaped by the specific people who are building it, with the specific limitations and inheritances and mistakes that those people bring. The Minutemen in Fallout 4 are trying to do something similar, and the story of the Minutemen, their collapse from a viable regional security organization into a scattered remnant, and the possibility of their rebuilding into something functional again, is a story about whether good intentions are enough, and whether a leaderless organization can recover from the specific kind of failure that comes from being too diffuse to respond effectively to concentrated force. The railroad operates through secrecy, using the specific tactics of resistance movements throughout history, cell structures, safe houses, cover identities, the perpetual tension between operational security and the human need for community and recognition. The railroad's members are not heroes in the traditional sense. They are people who have made a specific moral commitment and are paying the specific costs of that commitment in the specific currency of the wasteland exposure, violence, the constant risk of losing the network they have spent years building. The Brotherhood of Steel, in its multiple iterations across multiple games, is the Fallout universe's most persistent meditation on the tension between preserving the past and enabling the future. In Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland chapter, the Brotherhood has evolved into something approaching an actual humanitarian organization, the Elder Lions version, which the Brotherhood's more orthodox members consider a betrayal of the organization's founding principles. In the Midwest, in Fallout Tactics, the Brotherhood has evolved differently, incorporating Wastelanders in ways the California chapter would never accept. In New Vegas, the Mojave Brotherhood chapter has collapsed under the weight of its own isolationism. In Fallout 4, the Brotherhood under Elder Maxon has swung back toward orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy has hardened into something approaching fascism. The Brotherhood is Fallout's portrait of how institutions change across generations, how the values that inspired an institution's founding can be preserved or distorted as the institution grows and the original founders are replaced by people who knew them only as legends. The Brotherhood was founded by Roger Maxon, a soldier who defected from the U.S. military on discovering the true nature of the FEV experiments at Mariposa, and who wanted to preserve technology while preventing it from being used to destroy humanity again. This is a coherent and sympathetic founding vision. The institution that pursues that vision, 200 years later, has done things with it that its founder would not have recognized. This is not a story unique to post-apocalyptic fiction. It is a story about institutions, which are one of the ways that human beings try to make their values outlast themselves, and which are also one of the ways that human beings discover that outlasting yourself is harder than it looks. The institution preserves the form but not always the spirit. The name persists after the original meaning has changed into something else. The Brotherhood of Steel is still called the Brotherhood of Steel. The rebuilding continues. The factions argue. The Wastelanders farm their crops in the ruins of pre-war suburbs, and the Pip-Boy log entries pile up, and the radio plays its cheerful pre-war music into the irradiated air. War never changes. The world after the last war is harder and stranger, and more hopeful in some specific places, and more despairing in others, and full of people who did not choose to be born into it and are making of it what they can. The vault is behind you. Everything else is ahead. Section 25. The last question. What the wasteland asks of everyone who enters it. Before you close your eyes tonight, hold one thought from the wasteland with you. Not a battle, not a faction's agenda, not a theory about who fired first or what the obelisk means or whether the mysterious stranger is human. Just a person. Maybe it is the woman in Springvale, talking to the recording device in the 40 minutes she had between the sirens and the end. Maybe it is Isabella Proud at her camp past the map's edge, making notes about the ghouls she was studying in language that was careful and interested and genuinely loving in the way that scientists who are truly passionate about their subject sometimes write when they forget that they are supposed to be objective. Maybe it is the lonesome drifter by his campfire, playing his guitar with the portable competence of someone who has learned to carry his meaningful things with him because there is nowhere left to put them down. Maybe it is Moira Brown, after the bomb, looking at her changed hands and thinking that she is still herself, and that this is interesting. These people exist in a world that ended. They exist anyway. They persist. They find things worth doing in the ruins of the civilization that made the rules they were supposed to live by, and when the rules are gone, they make their own, imperfect and incomplete and genuinely theirs. The wasteland asks everyone who enters it the same question eventually. What do you value enough to carry? Not what did you have, what do you want to get back, what does the world owe you for the specific catastrophe of its ending? Those questions have no good answers. The world owes nothing. It ended anyway. What do you value enough to carry? The lone wanderer carries their father's dream of clean water for everyone. The courier carries a package they were hired to deliver and a question about why someone wanted them dead for carrying it. The sole survivor carries 200 years of frozen grief and a photograph of a life that no longer exists in any form they would recognize. And you carry whatever you carry, in whatever real world you are falling asleep in right now, in whatever place and time and set of circumstances that brought you to this particular quiet hour. The wasteland understands carrying things. It is made of people who carried things through conditions that should have made carrying anything impossible. The radio is still playing. The stars over the Commonwealth are still the same stars as everywhere else, slightly obscured by the lingering atmospheric effects of a nuclear exchange that happened 200 years ago, but still there, still navigable, still the same lights that people have been finding their way by since before the first story was told. The vault door is behind you. You made it out. Everything else is the world, and the world, ruined and strange and full of questions that have no clean answers, is still capable of being worth the effort of living in it. Good night. Sleep well. The mysterious stranger will keep watch. Appendix. 6 more things that live quietly in the lore. The preceding sections have traveled across the breadth of the Fallout universe. From the pre-war history that set everything in motion, to the cosmic horrors lurking beneath the wasteland's surface, to the quiet, particular human stories that make the series genuinely worth caring about. But there are always more threads. The Fallout universe accumulates detail the way old buildings accumulate history, not all of it visible at once, most of it requiring some patience and some willingness to look in corners that are not obviously interesting. Here are 6 more things that live quietly in the lore, for the hours when you need to keep the Wasteland company a little longer. The Silver Shroud and the Theater of Identity. Kent Connolly, in Good Neighbor, curates the only surviving broadcast of a pre-war radio drama called The Silver Shroud. He plays it on loop, partly out of love and partly out of something less explicable, a need, or a devotion, or a refusal to let the character stop existing just because the world that made the character no longer exists. The Silver Shroud was a fictional vigilante, a pre-war superhero of sorts, in the tradition of the pulp fiction heroes of the mid-20th century. He wore a distinctive costume and had a distinctive voice, and dispensed justice with a Tommy gun and a dry wit. Kent Connolly has every surviving episode memorized. He knows the voice, he knows the mannerisms. He is, in a specific and touching way, the Silver Shroud's only remaining fan, the entire remaining audience for a character who has otherwise been forgotten entirely. The sole survivor can put on the Silver Shroud costume and go into the Commonwealth as the character, speaking in the character's voice, delivering the character's specific brand of justice. Kent provides the instructions. The game asks you to commit to the performance in order to access certain dialogue options if you respond to enemies as the Silver Shroud, rather than as yourself. Things happen that would not otherwise happen. There are enemies who break at the idea that a pre-war legend has returned. There are moments when the costume confers a kind of authority that no amount of personal reputation could provide. This is an unusual mechanic, a game asking you to become a character within a character, to put on an identity and make it work, and it reflects something that the Fallout series does not always discuss openly but clearly thinks about: the role of myth and story and fictional identity in the post-nuclear world. The Silver Shroud is not real. He never was. But the idea of him, the image of someone who shows up when things are at their worst and does what needs doing and vanishes before gratitude becomes expectation, that idea has power. In the wasteland as everywhere else, Kent Connolly keeps the idea alive. The sole survivor can embody it. When you speak as the Silver Shroud, using the specific cadences of a radio character from 200 years ago, something happens in Good Neighbor and its surrounding area that would not happen if you spoke as yourself. The world responds to the costume, to the voice, to the symbol. This is, in miniature, the whole story of how human beings use narrative and identity and myth to organize reality, to make things possible that would not otherwise be possible, to extend the reach of individual action into something collective and meaningful. Kent Connolly knows this. He keeps the broadcast running. He is waiting for someone to wear the coat. The glowing sea's permanent weather. In the southwestern region of the Commonwealth, there is a place where it is always raining. The glowing sea is notable primarily for its radiation background levels high enough that even the best available power armor provides only partial protection that required dedicated preparation and supplies to navigate without suffering serious consequences. But it is also notable for its weather, which in the immediate area of the glowing sea is a permanent, slow, acidic rainfall that never stops, that falls from clouds that the nuclear exchange created and that the atmosphere has maintained in this localized pocket of permanently disrupted weather ever since. The rain in the glowing sea is not like rain anywhere else in the Commonwealth. It is quieter. It is pervasive, in a way that feels less like weather and more like an environmental condition, something that has always been true about this place and always will be. The ruins that survive in the glowing sea, and very few do, the blast damage here was more thorough than in the rest of the region, are coated with a specific kind of accumulation that the permanent rainfall has deposited over 2 centuries, a patina that makes them look like objects from deep underwater. The specific location in the glowing sea that Fallout 4 eventually takes you to the crater that turns out to be a Minutemen origin point, a location connected to the search for a specific character, is one of the game's most effectively atmospheric moments. Getting there requires sustained preparation and navigation through a region that the game has been building in the background as a zone of absolute desolation. The arrival feels earned because the journey to it was genuinely difficult. The permanent rain, the silence beneath it, the quality of light filtered through permanently contaminated cloud cover, these environmental details work together to create a specific and sustained mood that is, for lack of a better word, beautiful in the way that genuinely desolate things can sometimes be beautiful. The glowing sea is what the rest of the Commonwealth is, but more so. More thoroughly destroyed, more thoroughly remade, more thoroughly inhabited by the particular ecology that has developed in the century after the worst of the radiation settled. The creatures that live in the glowing sea are adapted to conditions that nothing else in the Commonwealth can tolerate. They are the extreme end of the wasteland's evolutionary divergence, the species that went furthest from their origin point in adapting to the world the bombs made. The rain keeps falling. The clouds do not clear. The Geiger counter speaks its constant commentary on the specific physics of what 200 years of atmospheric deposition has left in this particular watershed. It is, in its way, one of the most honest places in the Commonwealth. The glowing sea does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. The Chinese submarine and Zhao's 2 centuries. When the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, the Yangtze was in Boston Harbor. The Chinese nuclear submarine had been on a mission, a specific classified mission that the crew understood to be part of the larger war effort that had placed them within range of the American East Coast for reasons that are never fully detailed in the game. They launched their warheads. Then everything changed, and changed in a direction that no one on the Yangtze had planned for, and the submarine that was supposed to return to base never returned, because the base no longer existed, because the country that operated the base no longer existed, because the world in which that specific mission made sense had been replaced by a world in which almost nothing made sense. Captain Zhao survived. He survived as a ghoul, transformed by the radiation that leaked into the submarine's hull over the decades, and he survived in the particular way that ghouls survive, with the accumulated weight of 200 years of context, of having lived through the end of the world, and the long silence after it, and the slow rebuilding, and all of the specific, particular things that 200 years of history contain. He has been waiting. Not passively, not numbly, Zhao has been maintaining the submarine with the resources available to him, which are not sufficient to make the Yangtze seaworthy, but are sufficient to keep it operational in a minimal sense. He has been keeping records. The submarine's logs extend from the day of the Great War forward, and they document, in the precise language of military notation, gradually giving way to something more personal, 2 centuries of one person's attempt to maintain the form of a duty that has long since become impossible to fulfill. What Zhao wants is not rescue. Exactly. He wants closure. He wants to return home, or to do something that honors the idea of home, or to complete the mission in whatever form completion is available when the mission's original context has been atomized along with everything else. The sole survivor can help him get there, in the specific sense that the quest associated with the Yangtze provides the submarine with the capacity for one final action, something that cannot undo the war, cannot restore what was lost, cannot change the 200 years of waiting, but can be done, specifically and concretely, and can mean something in the doing. Zhao is not a villain. He is not framed as one, even though he was on the other side of a war that destroyed everything. He is a person who was doing his job when the world ended, and who has spent 2 centuries in the specific circumstances that his survival produced, and who has maintained himself in the specific sense of remaining a coherent person with values and purpose and things he cares about, against conditions that should have made that maintenance impossible. The Yangtze sits in Boston Harbor, its reactor still providing minimal power, its hull maintaining its structural integrity through luck and care. It is one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in the Commonwealth, a pre-war military submarine that has survived 2 centuries in an irradiated harbor because one ghoul has been maintaining it with whatever materials he could find and whatever knowledge he could apply. The Japanese samurai buried in its crew manifest is a mystery for another time or another theory, for whoever is inclined to follow the thread of how a pre-war era Japanese sword makes its way into the game story at all, and what it suggests about the submarine's history before it appeared in Boston Harbor on the morning the world ended. The living forest of Fallout 76, what survived? Appalachia's forests are old in the way that the Appalachian Mountains are old ancient beyond the scale of human civilization, shaped by geological processes that make the 200 years since the Great War a blink in the long rhythm of their existence. When the bombs fell, the radiation transformed these forests. The trees are mutated. In some areas, the fungi and plant life of the region have developed in directions that parallel the animal life's mutation, becoming larger, stranger, more aggressive in their adaptation to radiation, but they are also simply continuing. The forests of Fallout 76's Appalachia are denser and stranger than the pre-war forests were, but they are forests. They are ecologically functional in ways that nothing else in the post-nuclear world is quite so clearly functional. Animals live in them, hunt in them, are hunted in them. Things grow and die and decompose and feed the growth of other things. The forests region of Appalachia, in particular, has developed a specific and layered ecology that is one of the game's quietly remarkable achievements. Deer still exist. Beavers, mutated and enormous, still build their dams. The rivers still run, radioactive but flowing. The sky above the forests is sometimes not often, but sometimes genuinely clear, the kind of blue that makes you forget you are in a nuclear wasteland until the Geiger counter reminds you. What the forests of Fallout 76 represent, ecologically and thematically, is the persistence of the biosphere beneath the human catastrophe. The forests were there before the war. They are there after it. The specific character of their existence has changed, but the existence itself has not been interrupted in the way that human civilization's existence was interrupted. The mushroom trees and the giant plants and the carnivorous flora are strange new additions to an ecosystem that is, in its fundamental logic, continuous. There is something in this that connects to the larger Fallout theme of what changes and what doesn't. The world was destroyed in the sense that human civilization was destroyed. The planet was not destroyed. The biosphere was not destroyed. The long, slow process of life finding ways to persist in whatever conditions obtain was not interrupted. It adapted, as it always has, as it always will, regardless of whether human beings are among the things adapting. The forests of Appalachia do not know about the Great War. They do not know about Vault-Tec or the NCR or the Brotherhood of Steel or any of the factions competing for the post-war world. They are doing what they were doing before any of those things existed. Growing, competing, dying, growing again. The most frightening thing about the Fallout universe, looked at from a long enough perspective, is not that it ended. It is that it mostly continued. And the part that continued does not particularly need the part that ended. The forests will outlast every vault. The rivers will outlast every faction. The old mountains of Appalachia were old before the first human being stood on their slopes, and will be old long after the last one is gone. This is not comforting exactly, but it is true, and the Fallout series is one of the few extended fictional universes willing to let that truth sit in the background without trying to resolve it into something more human-scaled and therefore more comfortable. The trees grow, the rivers run, the deer pick their way through underbrush that is also, technically, descended from the deer that ate it before the bombs fell. The vault that wasn't there. There are references in the Fallout lore in terminal entries, in NPC dialogue, in the documents that Vault-Tech's internal bureaucracy left, scattered across various locations to vaults that appear in the official records but cannot be found in the world. Some of these are simply vaults the games never got around to detailing, locations held in reserve for future development, or cut for time, or simply left as the suggestion of something rather than a fully realized thing. But some of them have a more interesting character. They are mentioned in context that suggests they existed, and that something specific happened to them, something that removed them from the world, in a way that left only the documentation behind. Vault 24 is one of these. Mentioned initially only through a jumpsuit accessible by console commands in Fallout New Vegas, confirming the vault's existence in the Mojave's lore without locating it on any accessible map. Vault 24 was eventually given a narrative home in the Fallout TV series as the vault where Vault-Tech experimented with brainwashing American patriots into communists. The experiment's implications that Vault-Tech was willing to engage in identity erasure as a research program, that the ideological content of a person could be replaced as thoroughly as any other behavioral variable, are disturbing in ways that connect to the synthetic personhood questions from the Institute storyline. But Vault 24's physical location in the Mojave remains ambiguous. You cannot walk to it, you cannot enter it. It exists, fully realized in the lore, and the physical space that should correspond to it is simply not there, not accessible, not part of the navigable game world. This is the liminal space that some of Fallout's most interesting mysteries occupy, fully present in the documentation, absent in the terrain. The records exist. The place they describe does not, or not anymore, or not in any form that the available evidence can locate. What happened to vaults that are in the records but not in the world? The obvious answers are mundane. They were built, they were overwhelmed, they collapsed, they were buried, they were simply not detailed enough to appear as a fully realized location. These are the gaming production realities of a series that spans decades and has more lore than any one team can fully realize in any one game. But the in-universe answer is more interesting. A vault that is in the records but not in the terrain has either been destroyed so thoroughly that no trace remains, or has been hidden deliberately, or has become something other than a physical location. The documentation that points toward it without arriving at it is the digital equivalent of a trail that ends mid-wilderness, the most unsettling kind of trail, the kind that invites you to wonder whether it stopped because something prevented the person who was walking it from going further. The Fallout universe has always been comfortable with its own incompleteness. It fills the gaps with the suggestion of more, with the implication that the world contains more than what you can see, that every corner not explored might contain another Isabella Proud, another Zhao, another obelisk in a cave beneath an office building. The vaults that are in the records but not in the world are a specific case of this general principle, applied to the series' central institution. They are evidence that even the comprehensive brutality of Vault-Tech's project had loose ends, had contingencies that did not play out as planned, had things that happened that neither the records nor the terrain can fully account for. The documentation remains. The location does not. Whatever is missing from that space, the space itself is a shape, and the shape of what is missing tells you something about what was there. The question at the center of the Fallout universe. At the very center of the Fallout universe, beneath all the factions and the vaults and the Lovecraftian horror and the dark corporate satire and the beautiful individual human stories and the permanent philosophical questions about personhood and identity and war, there is one question that the series keeps returning to without ever quite resolving. Is it possible to learn? Not in the sense of acquiring skills or knowledge. In the deeper sense, is it possible for a civilization, a human civilization, With all the specific impulses and institutional tendencies and accumulated inheritances that human civilizations bring to recognize the patterns that lead to catastrophe early enough to do something about them? Is the distance between "this is how things are going" and "this is where things are going" ever navigable in real time, or only visible in retrospect? The Fallout universe's answer is deliberately ambiguous. The Great War happened. The civilization that produced it is gone. But the tendencies that produced it, the corporate logic, the ideological purity projects, the willingness to treat people as resources, the specific combination of technological power and ethical immaturity are all present in the factions competing for the post-war world. The NCR has corruption, the Brotherhood has isolationism, the Institute has contempt for the people it studies. Caesar's Legion has slavery. None of them are the old world, but all of them are made of people who are made by the old world, and the old world left its fingerprints on every one of them. And yet, there is Moira Brown writing her guide. There is Nick Valentine working his cases. There is the Railroad doing the specific and costly work of freeing people who have been told they are not people. There is the Lonesome Drifter playing his guitar. These are not answers to the question. They are people in the middle of their own answers to the question, doing their specific work in the specific place the world's failure left them, without guarantees, without certainty, without any assurance that what they are doing will be remembered, or will matter, or will be enough. This is what the Fallout universe is ultimately about. Not the bombs, not the vaults, not the factions, or the monsters, or the horror, or the satire. The bombs are the background, the people are the story. The people doing their specific and incomplete and imperfect work in the ruined world that a civilization's failures produced, this is the thing that the series has been saying, in its particular way, for 3 decades. The question at the center is whether it is possible to learn. The answer, in every Fallout game and in every moment between them, is it depends. It depends on the specific people. It depends on the specific choices. It depends on whether the lesson that the Wasteland offers patiently, persistently, in every terminal entry and every Vault Boy grimace and every lonely radio signal is taken seriously or not. The lesson is in the rubble. The rubble is everywhere. The choosing is still happening. Thank you for spending this time in the Wasteland. If these stories kept you company tonight, a like or a subscription genuinely means the world. It helps more of these reach the people who need something quiet to fall asleep to. More Fallout, more deep dives, more long strange nights in the Wasteland are coming. The next one will be here when you need it. Good night from wherever this found you.